may ensure transparent competition and free access to market for all public and private operators, as well as fighting the monopoly and antitrust policies are a prerequisite for a strong national economy. So we mean by the policy for competition all procedures that are likely to effectively contribute to structure the market and to develop the competition behavior and the other behaviors such as the monopoly and the antitrust. Ladies and gentlemen, the policy of competition, which aims to fight against monopoly, will face many challenges, especially when it comes to finding a balance between releasing the competition and the market. So we have many challenges that we are going to face. So we should face these challenges through policies and economic policies and legislations imposed by the current international realities. So we should promulgate laws and establish bodies in order to implement all these laws. They are the pillars for a competitive environment, transparent competitive environment, working fairly and equitably in the market. Ladies and gentlemen, an effective policy for regulating the competition and antitrust will protect the interests of both the consumers and the producer. So it will allow the consumers to have products and services with high quality and affordable prices. It will also allow the producers to increase quality and to improve the quality in order to increase their benefits and to contribute in the development of the country. In order to do so, the council is organizing meetings in order to listen to the concerns of the economic operators, according to the instructions of the President of the Republic, to be a mediator between the economic operators and the public authorities. So we are working in this regard, so in order to find solutions for the national economy and even at the regional and continental levels. I would like to seize this opportunity in order to remind the important role that the civil society can play in this regard, especially the Association of Consumer Protections, in order to ensure free competition and to spread the culture of competition in our country, which will protect the consumers and increase the coordination between different bodies at the national and local levels for the interest of the producers and the consumers at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to enrich this topic, the Council has engaged many international experts in order to animate this meeting. We accept them. We thank them for accepting our invitation online. In addition to the experts from the national institutions, once again, I would like to thank all participants for participating with us. I hope that all conditions and arrangements provided by the Knesset will be effective in making this meeting successful. We will submit the recommendations of this meeting to the President of the Republic and to the government in order to be taken into account when preparing the project law for the competition and antitrust and the rehabilitation of the National Council of Competition. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I would like to open this meeting officially. Thank you very much. Thank you to Mr. Mr. the President of the National Economic, Social and Environmental Council for this opening speech. Before we start with the first speeches and presentations, I would like to say that the morning session will be dedicated for the international experiences, including the Chinese experience that will be delivered by our experts, Suzanne, who is a senior Chinese expert in this regard, and from the president of the competition department from the OECD. From Italy, from Madrid, we have Lynn, who will give us the experience of Europe in this regard. So this morning session will be dedicated for the international experiences. So the people present with us here can ask questions in order to benefit from the experience of these experts, eminent experts. As to the afternoon session, it will be dedicated for the national experts from our country and from abroad. On their top, Madame Rim Lusif, who is an international expert. We have Mr. Slimani, who is an expert at the Competition Council. We have Mr. Mas'i Rafiq. He is an Algerian based in Dubai, so he will be online. That's why I would like to urge all participants to stay till the end of this meeting, till the last presentation, in order to come up with recommendations and with strong proposals that will be submitted to the government in order to enrich the competition project law. That's why I urge all colleagues to be here with us till we end the proceedings of these meetings in order to animate this study day. So the president wanted to encourage people and young people, especially the entrepreneurs. So we have Mr. Iskander Shakib. He is a young man who studied abroad and lived abroad. He came back in Algeria in order to establish a startup in Algeria, to work in Algeria. He deserves all encouragement and all tribute. He is a member at the Knesset as a representative of the startups. So the floor is yours, Mr. Shakib. Thank you very much. You can come forward.
Merci à tous. Donc, comme je reprends un peu ce qu'a dit Monsieur le Président du...
Thank you very much. As Mr. the President said today, the quality of the debate about the purchasing power and the competition, as it is an international topic. We have many voices that raises. We should keep the market regulating itself, but what the self-regulating market called is the efficient market, where the actors transition will fix the offer and the requests, where the price will serve the consumer. Today we talk about this topic, or the topic about the regulation and competition. To have an efficient market, we need rules. It's the body of the regulation and the competition in the world, enabled to avoid situation of domination, monopoly, or antitrust. We will have today some high-level speakers. Now we have the chairman is speaking English.
We have some great experts and prominent experts in competition and antitrust regulation. They will give us an overview of what is the state of research today, and also give us some feedback about what is happening in the European Union, China, and other parts of the world, so that we can understand how now in Algeria we can create the best framework for our economy. So we will start with an expert from the OECD. The OECD has a strong knowledge about competition they have a competition division which provide institution and government with many guidelines and best practices in terms of competition. So we'll start with Mr. Antonio Capobianco from Italy, and in charge of is acting head at competition division at the OECD. So Mr. Capobianco, the floor is yours. You have 13 minutes, including 1 or 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Skander. Let me, first of all, I hope you can see me and hear me well. So let me thank, first of all, the National Economic and Social and Environmental Council for the invitation. It's an honor and a real pleasure to be with you today, although I'm quite sad that I could not join you in person in Algiers. I'm sure there will be other opportunities, especially as your discussions on reforms and implementing competition policy in your country move forward. So let me just share with you my screen. So here I have prepared a few slides for this presentation. So I've been asked to discuss with you the benefits of competition policy for a national economy, and I think we heard from the opening remarks of Mr. Thier, the president of the National Economic and Social and Environmental Council, the importance of competition policy for an economy which is based on open market. So what I will do today is really try and walk you through the key role that competition plays in a modern economy. And as you can see here, it's really a central policy that allows the economies to grow. So it's the fuel of the engine of growth for a national economy. It helps increasing productivity of firms. So it puts firms under pressure, under competitive pressure, forcing them to reduce costs, to be more efficient, and therefore increase productivity. But it has also effects and an impact on broader variables like employment and inequality. Can help increasing employment, so reducing unemployment in a country, but also helping filling the gap between the poorest and the richest in our society, so reducing the inequality gap. So this is really why we believe that competition and competition policy should be a central policy for any government, a key part of industrial policy, of other policies. So what I will try to do really in the next 20 minutes or so, before I get a couple of questions, if you have any, is really to discuss with you what are the benefits of competition policy. And I've grouped them in 3 areas, in 3 main type of benefits. Aggregate economic benefits, which can be short-term and for consumers, and long-term in terms of innovation and growth. But there are also distributional benefits in terms of, as I said just a moment ago, reduction of inequalities, reducing poverty, increasing employment. And finally, I will discuss very quickly social benefits that competition policy can have for our society. So let me go through these different types of benefits and show you some evidence of how competition policy can be useful and can be central to a national economy. So starting with the first one, the short-term benefits for consumers and other buyers, including the public sector. Now, for those of you who come from my world, the world of competition enforcement, you're very familiar with the harm that anti-competitive behavior has or can have on consumers. And these are just some of the evidence from actual cases or from actual enforcement experiences from competition authorities around the world. The studies, and in particular studies from Professor Connors, who has looked at cartels, international cartels, cross-border cartels over a long period of time, over 25 years, he really discovered that international cartels affect an enormous part of international commerce, more than 750 billion US dollar per year, and that the overcharge, that is the price, the increased price that consumer pay because for goods and services because of anti-competitive behavior can be even up to 40%. And if you just take one cartel only, so one of the many international cartels that have been investigated by competition authorities, maybe the one that really raised the attention of competition authorities to the importance of fighting cartels, the vitamins cartels from the early 90s, only that case resulted in overcharges to importing countries for more than for about 2.7 million US dollars. So the harm from cartels is significant. Now, it's very hard, of course, to pinpoint to a figure or to a number in terms of how more consumers pay for goods that are subject to anti-competitive practices. So what is the overcharge? What is the markup that a cartel can impose on consumers? Here you see a number of studies that have tried to have looked at actual cases, actual cartels, real cartels, and tried to measure the overcharge. You can see here that the studies are look at different cartels and they use different methodologies, but on average, we can estimate that it's the price that consumers end up paying because of anti-competitive behaviors is around 30-35%, and sometimes even more if you look at some of these studies from academics. Now, the consumers are not the people like us who buy goods and services are not the only one who are harmed by anti-competitive behaviors. Governments themselves are buyers; they are purchasers through public procurement, and they can also be significantly harmed. And therefore, the harm to taxpayers, to all of us, the indirect harm to taxpayers can be huge. As you may know, public procurement is a significant part of an economy. Governments spend through public procurement significant resources. I have figures on average at the OECD, so the 37 member countries of the OECD, which estimate that public procurement accounts for up to 13% of GDP in the OECD area. So it's a significant part of the OECD economies. It is about 1/3 of government expenditures. So we're talking about significant public resources invested through public procurement. And here in this slide, you see a picture of a cartel, of the effects of a cartel on public procurement. This is from a real case, an actual case in Mexico. These are bids, the different colors, dots, and symbols that you see are bids that pharmaceutical companies have put in for tender to sell to the government, to the Mexican government, to the Mexican Social Security Institute in particular, insulin for human consumption. These are insulin that is used in hospitals all around Mexico. And you can see here on the left-hand side of this chart that bids were almost identical for a long period of time until at the end of 2005, and they were relatively high. This is the picture. This is what happens when you have a price fixing, when you have an anti-competitive behavior, when you have a cartel. Now, the government changed its procurement policy, realizing that the prices that they were paying for insulin were too high compared to international standards. They introduced more competition in tenders, and you can see on the right-hand side of the slide the effects of competition. The bids went down, they became more dispersed. That's more of an image of competition. And the difference, which is the point I want to make, between the cartel price and the competitive price was significant, even up to 55% difference. So they can see how also governments are harmed, are victims of anti-competitive behavior. Now, but firms' behavior are only one of the sources of restriction of competition. Regulatory frameworks, so the laws and regulations that governments themselves design for certain sectors can also have an impact on competitive outcomes. And we at the OECD have been doing a lot of work in trying to help governments reform those regulatory systems to introduce more competition. And here the evidence on the impact on the benefits, let's say, that consumers can have from this pro-competitive reform is huge. This is just one example from one of our projects in Greece, where we reviewed sector regulation and legislation in 4 economic sector of Greece, and we estimated the consumer benefit from removing those anti-competitive restrictions, and the estimates of the benefits for consumers is huge, more than 5.2 billion euros. So these are short-term benefits for consumers and public buyers, but there are also long-term benefits for the economy as such, in terms of more innovation and growth of the economy. So let me just show you what is this virtuous circle that allows competition policy, and competition authority to promote economic growth in a national economy. So you see here, competition policy and competition authorities do 2 things. They promote, they enforce competition law, so they fight anti-competitive practices, the cartels that I just mentioned before, for example, but they also do a lot of advocacy with other policymakers, ministries, regulators, other public agencies, to promote liberalization, deregulation, free trade. This activity, so the effect of competition policy is that it opens markets to competition. So it facilitates entry of more efficient firms, of new competitors, and the exit of inefficient firms that leave the market. So this is a very beneficial process that promotes innovation, but also promotes more efficient behavior by firms. And here, maybe I open a parenthesis, because firms are not only those who are privately owned, but also those who are owned by the government itself, so the state-owned enterprises. And some national economies have a very large SOE sector, and there we know that efficiencies for SOEs, the competition can promote efficient behavior by SOEs, and that's extremely beneficial for the government itself. This produce higher productivity growth in the affected industries, and ultimately helps economies to grow in the long run, to increase their GDP, to increase their trade with foreign countries, and to attract more investment from foreign investors. Now, this is not just a theoretical, this diagram is not just a theoretical mechanism. There are studies who have tried to measure, to some extent, the impact of competition on productivity and growth. And here you have just a couple of these studies from the UK and from South Africa. The first one really tells you that most competitive firms have experienced productivity growth rates around 4.5% higher than the least competitive one. So competition has increased productivity of individual firms. But also in South Africa, this similar evidence show that productivity growth for more competitive environment, for competitive sector of 2 to 2.5% per year. These are studies from Asia, from Japan, or from India, very consistent with what I've just mentioned before. In Japan, the sectors which were growing, which were successfully exporting industries, so there was increase in those industries are those who are less subject to cartels, to anti-competitive behavior. India, very similar data from the Indian economy. Now, as I mentioned, going back to this point about regulation and regulated sector, and how the regulation is designed and sometimes can hold back growth itself, you can see here evidence from European countries and the correlation between the degree of regulation and the pace of growth of the economy. So you can see that countries which are more regulated, Italy, my country, is one of them, are those who are less, that grow less quickly than others. While countries like Swiss or Sweden, the US, Canada, where they are less regulated, the degree of regulation is less, they tend to grow much faster than countries that are highly regulated. So there is a very close correlation between the degree of regulation of sectors and the ability of the economy to grow faster. The one example that really shows how regulatory reforms, pro-competitive regulatory reforms, help a country to grow and to grow faster is Australia. And those of you who are familiar with the history of Australia will remember the Hilmer reforms in the early 90s, in the first part of the 90s, where Australia really engaged in a wide-ranging set of reforms to deregulate, to eliminate restriction to competition, to promote competition enforcement. And you can see here the impact of those efforts for the following 20 years or so. You can see the development of the development of the GDP in Australia. The red line is consistently higher than the average growth in GDP of the other OECD countries. That is consistently considered the effect of pro-competitive reforms that Australia put in place since the early 90s, as I said. Now, the same evidence or the same conclusion you can reach also in developing countries. This is, again, evidence from OECD study of India, the different states in the Indian Federation, and you can see that states who are less regulated tend to grow much faster than those who are more highly regulated. So you see Goa, for example, is much faster growing economy than the West Bengal state in the Indian Federation. Let me now move to the second group of benefits, these distributional benefits that I mentioned before, so the impact on inequality, poverty reduction, and employment. And here we've done some studies that looks at the relationship between cartels and monopolies and the welfare of people. And we know that cartels and monopolies raise price for everyone, but we also know, and that is the evidence that our studies have found, that they tend to increase income and welfare, or especially of those who already own financial wealth. And so data from 8 OECD countries really show that an average that market power really increases the wealth of the richest 10% in the population by 12 and 21%, while it reduces income of the poorest 20% of the population between 14% and 19%. So the fewer part of society benefits more from monopolies and from cartels. So they get richer and richer to the expense of the poorest in our societies. This is evidence from Mexico. We're looking at impact of market power on some of the key household spending, tortillas, chicken, milk, so the basic food for poor families. And here again, the study shows like the harm caused by monopoly power is greatest among the poorest 10% of households. So the poorest suffer more. Now, all of this can be illustrated by this cartoon. I think it's worth 1,000 words. And price fixing, so anti-competitive behavior, really makes some of essential goods almost unreachable for the poorest in society. For wealthy people, doubling the price of bread is not a big issue. They can pay 2 or 3 times the price of bread. For poor families, those price increase, anti-competitive price increase, can really be extremely detrimental. They can even bring some essential goods out of reach for these families. So this is how competition can reduce this inequality gap between the richest in our societies and the poorest. But competitive markets can also help other policies like employment policies, and they can, in the long term, studies have shown how more competitive economies, they become more dynamic, they create more opportunities, especially they create jobs. And you can see here evidence from the European Union, where the competition from the European single market has reduced unemployment by 0.5%, or evidence from France, where regulatory restriction reduced employment in the retail sector by 10%. So by eliminating those restrictions, you can, as an economy, as a government, as a policymaker, promote employment and more employment. Let me now move quickly to the last group of benefits that competition can promote, and these are social benefits. And here, really, I think it was mentioned by the opening remarks of the president. Really, the anti-competitive behavior, they create rents. They create illegal rents, and those rents can be used to distort the democratic process, to distort the political process, to fund if I can use that word, corruption. And this is why more than 100 years ago in the United States, the first provisions, competition laws, were called antitrust. They were fighting the large economic powers, the trusts that were growing more and more in those years, and they were really affecting the democratic process and the political life in the United States. So that is really the origin of antitrust provision, of competition laws, really to fight corruption in countries. So more competitive economies, they lead to less corrupt and more social, equal societies. Finally, and I will conclude with this, just a few words on the relationship between competition and other macro policies like trade and investment. We know that countries which have promoted more open markets, more competitive markets, were able to attract more trade because competitive markets really create trade opportunities and enhance gains for the economy from trade flows, import and export. At the same time, we know that competitive markets create investment opportunities. So foreign investor will be more keen, more prone to invest in markets where there is competition, where they have opportunities to grow, where, as I said before, rents will not distort the market functionings, and so you will really increase gains from foreign investment. So again, competition is I finished from where I started, really is a key policy to promote the growth of national economies, is the fuel of the engine of market economy. So that's why we at the OECD have been, as has been said by the chair, we've been promoting best practices, building on experience from jurisdiction from all around the world. We've been pushing for having competition laws, from having effective and independent competition authorities who can enforce those laws and can advocate for the role of competition with other parts of the government. So there's a lot of material out there. I just if you'll have access to my slides, you can go and read more about all of these things. And so with that, I really thank you for your attention, and I'm of course available for any question or reaction from your side. Can you still hear me?
Now we can hear you. Just now we know that you must be speaking. This is Suzanne speaking. Can you see me and hear me well?
I can hear you, but I cannot see you.
Let me see.
So is Mr. Capodilco still with us?
Yes, I can hear you now, and I can...
Okay, so the first question was about public procurement. Do you have a tool that worked clearly in the efficiency of public procurement?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the question. We have developed about 10 years ago or so a set of guidelines, and there is an OECD recommendation that on these guidelines on how to promote more competition in public procurement. And the focus of our work has been particularly on how to reduce the risk of collusion, so bid rigging, if you want to use the American jargon. These are agreements, anti-competitive agreements between bidders to restrict competition in the tender process. Our work, and I can point you to these guidelines if you're interested, really focus on two elements: how contracting authorities, procurement officials can better design tenders to reduce the risk of collusion arising in the first place. Sometimes the procurement process itself, the tender process itself, facilitates the insurgence of anti-competitive agreement. So there is advice and guidelines, best practice on designing tenders to make them more pro-competitive. The second element that we focus on is on detection. How contracting authorities, the procurement official, can detect signs of collusion. What are the red flags that they should be aware of when they are running a tender process that could point them to the possible, the existence of a possible cartel, so that they can intervene early on and avoid the harm that I mentioned before that those cartels can have on public procurement. So there is a lot of experience. We have done projects with many countries to help them implement those best practices and those guidelines. We've done those in many OECD and non-OECD jurisdictions, and there's a wealth of materials and recommendation from OECD for contracting authority on how to promote more competitive outcome. Ultimately, we want governments and contracting authority to reach value for money, and the money is really taxpayers' money, so it's our money. So we want government to spend public resources efficiently and not unnecessarily pay high prices because of anti-competitive behaviors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Capobianco. So maybe we will have some questions later from the audience here. Now we will have the chance to hear from a specialist and an expert from a country that has known a very high growth in the last decades, naming China. China, as you know, has become one of the biggest economy in the world. And this growth, this hyper rapid growth, has led to the creation, to the natural creation of some cartels. And with really strong policy, the country managed to end this natural process. So now we will hear from Mrs. Susan Ning, which is an expert in antitrust and competition law in China. They will give a global overview and insight about what happened in China and what is happening today. Mrs. Susan Ning, you have with us? I think it was working a few minutes ago, but maybe. This is Suzanne. You can hear?
Yes, I'm having my colleagues helping me out here. So now I'm.
Okay, floor is yours.
Now it's good. Hello. 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 Is it good?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Hello. Yes, we hear you. You can start. Thank you.
Okay, so I can continue, right?
Yes, 30 minutes, including one or two questions, but 30 minutes global.
Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to be online and sharing the experience of China. I will cover some of the basics since this is an introduction about China, but also weigh in the most updated practice from Chinese legislative and law enforcement agencies, especially during the pandemic prevention situation, as well as introducing the platform economy concept. The overall review of anti-monopoly law in China may go back to 2008, where on the 1st of August that year, we enacted the anti-monopoly law of PRC. This is the very first comprehensive law dealing with competition, even though before that we have various laws and legislative pieces dealing with competitive behavior in the market, like the anti-unfair competition law, like the consumer protection law. And also, this is regarded as an economic constitution for China to prevent monopolies behavior by reaching the monopoly agreement and to protect fair market competition and to raise economic efficiency, promote steady development of the economy. Of course, we have in the legislation, we have the reference and also largely to the EU competition law and the practice. But after 11 years plus, 10 years plus learning process, China has its localized experience. And since last year, China is making its effort to update and amend its anti-monopoly law, and even trying to introduce into the law the new platform economy concept. At the meanwhile, for the localization of the anti-monopoly law, the authority has issued regulations on administrative abuse, automobile antitrust guidelines, a series of supporting regulations and guidance on the monopolies behavior, leniency, and etc. And also, particularly for IP right guidelines for IPs regarding friend arrangement, and also the very recent guidelines, which is publicized February this year. That is the guidelines of platform economy. As I said, China legislative bodies and enforcement agencies are making its best efforts to break through to incorporate the economic development into the legislation. At the beginning, the enforcement agencies are, instead of agency, actually we have 3 agencies. And also with the reform in 2018, after the law was enacted, 10 years later, the 3 has emerged into one that's called the State Administration for Market Regulation, the SAMR. And under the SAMR itself covers many enforcement authorizations, and one of its bureau is Anti-Monopoly Bureau. It is responsible for the review, investigation, and the punishment of cases involving monopolies agreement, and the concentration of undertakings. The authorities has caused a number of far-reaching consequences to the law enforcement in China. First of all, the standard for law enforcement has been unified, because in the old days where 3 agencies are enforcing, like the NDRC are enforcing price-related anti-monopoly law clauses, and the State Administration for Business Operation is enforcing non-price related, and the Ministry of Commerce is enforcing the concentration of business operators. When coming to special issues like the leniency issue, the standards, and how to define market, we could find that the 3 agencies may have their different views and also law enforcement standards. So the law enforcement standard has been unified after the 3 emergency merged into one, and solve the issues where law could be concurrently applied but with different interpretation. Illegal clues were grasped because the ability of the Bureau to jointly handle cases is very much improved, and the issue of merger could lead to clues of collusion in the market behavior. which is impossible in the old days, where three agencies didn't exchange information in that regard. And of course, with a fewer constraints, law enforcement resources are more concentrated on handling major cases and new cases. This is a very typical, traditional, parts of the law is how the law are covering the antitrust issues. In the middle is the monopolies agreement, covering both horizontal and vertical. And of course, abuse of a market dominant position is also regulated. On the left, we see the concentration of business undertaking, and that is also very traditional standard. But on the very right, we have the abuse of administrative power. That is very China specific, because the government has traditionally played a role in the market, in the marketplace or economic running, and then the administrative power may constrain or eliminate the competition in the marketplace. That is why the Chinese AML has also regulation regarding the possible abuse of administrative power. And this also has been reflected in the fair competition mechanism being established about 6 years ago, where the new laws, legislations, and even local guidelines, policies has to go through the fair competition review before they can issue it. And state-owned enterprises should also go through their behavior, market behavior, should also be subject to such a fair competition review mechanism if they are found to benefit extra or unfairly from their position as a state-owned enterprises, or abusing their position in discriminating their trading party. The legal fines liabilities are 1 to 10%, which has been increased for the failure of a report of concentration of business operators, because the current 1 to 10% applies to the behavior violation, meaning that the monopolies agreement or abuse of dominance. But for the failure of reporting concentration of a business operator, the fine was very limited. But with the new law at amendment seeking public comment, the failure of reporting the business concentration is also subject to 1 to 10% generally. Of course, there are also other clauses which may reduce the fine, but the general line is as such. Definitely, the monetary penalty is not all of the liabilities for violation. Confiscation of illegal income, civil damages, or of course the clauses so violating AML may be announced null and void. Extensive and long-running antitrust investigation, reputation damages, and etc. Business disruption, that could be also a side effect for such a violation. But nevertheless, we don't have the criminal liability for violation under the AML unless you obstruct the investigation into the anti-monopoly behavior. For horizontal agreement, is also the very traditional or very typical, like a price fixing, limiting the product and sales, limit the R&D input, the market segmentation or consumer segmentation, joint boycotts, and etc. the form of such an agreement could be in written, could be oral, could be concerted behavior with the sensitive information exchange to be proved. Of course, there will be other activities, but depending on the situation, to be nailed down for violation. But they don't necessarily have to be market share related. But in the new amended draft for anti-monopoly law, there were a safe harbor mechanism being established. But how the harbor, or how much percentage for a horizontal or how much percentage for a vertical to stay in a safe harbor regarding your market share, is understood to be subject to future implementing rules or guidelines. But nevertheless, it's good to see the safe harbor system has been established in concept in the new draft. Excuse me, I kind of have the. I'm not sure whether I'm on the.
The development of horizontal monopoly agreement display.
This is okay. This is the still on screen, because the screen dropped. So okay. So the law enforcement authority show very strong expertise in investigation of monopoly agreement from its regular to mature law enforcement. They are not only looking at a typical monopoly agreement, they could also look at the hub and spoke collusion. We don't have sensitive information exchange violation by itself, but sensitive information exchange, which may have certain link or may have led to the concerted action, then that will be also targeted. And of course, with the algorithm being taken into consideration in evaluating both horizontal behavior or vertical, then the collusion under the algorithm is also being looked at and examined. We introduced the leniency program in the anti-monopoly law, and of course this is like a fast run game. Nothing very particular in China comparing with the others. Hub and spoke is considered by nature is a horizontal arrangement rather than what appeared to look like a vertical. And in the new draft, it's particularly provided in Article 17 and Article 18 in the two different drafts. It is added as a clause is a particular added addressing hub and spoke conspiracy, and also in the local legislation in Shanghai, where it's said like a guidelines for Shanghai anti-monopoly law regulation, it also explicitly mentioned that the hub and spoke conspiracy will be a violation. For vertical monopoly agreement, it's between, of course, we know it's between a business operator and its transaction counterparts. RPM is forbidden in China. It's per se illegal. It's the language itself indicates it's per se illegal. We can use a case later to illustrate that is mainly understood to be per se illegal. It is about fixing the price of products to be resold or setting the minimum price of products to be sold. That is under Article 14, Item 1 and 2 of the current AML. And of course, there is a catch-all clause under the Article 14. It's item 3 said non-price related vertical monopoly may also be reviewed by relevant authority, which oftenly understood to include exclusive purchases, exclusive sales, territory restrictions, segmentations, or customer restrictions. There is a case regarding the vertical arrangement, the price restraint on vertical level. The Hainan Price Bureau has investigated a company called Your Technology for its reaching vertical monopoly agreement, mainly restricting the retailer for its retail price, and has enforced against such a behavior. Then the company has brought the Bureau to the Hainan court, challenging the vertical agreement by saying that it does not have the competitive harm. So even though they have performed the behavior, but shouldn't be punished. The first instance court has confirmed has supported the complainant, the company, Your Technology, while it is appealed by the Hainan Price Bureau to the higher court at Hainan province. And the Hainan higher courts held that the competitive harm is not a constituent condition for the RPM agreement, indicating that RPM is a per se illegal rather than by rule of examined by rule of reason. Your Technology, the company, still was unhappy or not agreeable, so they petitioned for retrial to the Supreme People's Court, who held again that the AML enforcement authorities only need to identify the illegal behavior to establish the illegal behavior rather than prove the existence of competition harm. This is a very typical case in China. Of course, other non-price vertical behavior, monopolies behavior, could cover territory restriction, consumer restriction, exclusive arrangement, tie-in, and etc. Those provisions has been reflected in many regulations in effect, such as the automobile anti-monopoly regulation, such as the Shanghai local anti-monopoly regulation. It was even in the formal guidelines for platform economy as a draft, but later on deleted after it's officially enacted later on. Abusive behavior, abuse of dominance. In accordance with the AML, the constituent conditions to determine behavior to be abusive of its market dominance, you've got to have the dominant position to be established in relevant market, and you've got to have abusive behaviors, and you have no justifiable reasons, and you should have a competitive harm. This is for the, of course, the harm part depends. We call it depends. It really depends on whether it is heard by the administrative agency or is heard by the court. If it is heard by the court, then the competitive harm needs to be established. While if it is the case is investigated by administrative agency, then not necessarily the harm shall be established. The prohibited abusive behaviors are listed out in Article 17 of the AML. We see very similar, like selling products at unfairly high prices, or buying products at unfairly low prices, or below cost without justifiable causes. For example, refusing to trade with a trading party without justification. We could see that in the new platform economy antitrust regulation, the refusal of deals could mean that the business operator for a platform may use its dominant position as an operator for the platform, where all the other business operators are residing on such a platform for their trading, while the platform operator himself may also sell the same or similar product, competing products or service on the platform. So it's not only operating the platform, but competing with the other undertakings on the platform. So because of such a position, they could easily stop, delay, or suspend any trading with the trading party who is operating on its platform, or at least they can use very much invisible measures, such as like the platform rules, the algorithm, the technology, or the allocation of volume flows to impose unfair limitation obstacles, which actually made the other trading party impossible to trade on the platform. And of course, in this very regulation, the platform economy regulation, it also mentioned the essential facilities. Of course, it has listed out certain factors to establish an operator of a platform to be an operator of an essential facility, such as the percentage of the platform in relevant market, also considering the other platform operator, and also whether it is easily to be substituted by the other platform operator, and also the level of dependency of the other business operator on such a platform, and also whether there are certain effects, negative or positive, to open such a platform to all the other business operators. So in the platform economy antitrust regulation, all these factors will be taken into consideration even up to the essential facility level to analyze refusal of deals. There are also restrictions of a trading party. The restriction of trading party is a very hotly enforced by the agencies in the term of pick one out of two, meaning that if you are a business undertaking and on a particular platform, and the platform requires you not to deal with the other platform or not to participate in the discount activities, promoting activities in other platform, that is a pick one out of two, meaning that you are refusing the trading party on your platform to pick the other platform. And we have very famous case against a couple of giant platform operators, including Alibaba, Tencent, Meituan. We also have seen in this abusive, prohibited abusive behaviors, we also see that the tie-in or imposing unfair trading conditions. In the platform economy regulation, it is clearly indicate that using the standard clauses, the pumping windows, this necessary steps for operating on the platform, which lead to the trading party unable to choose, make their own choices, or to amend, or to refuse, so that tie-in is possible, or unfair trading conditions are imposed, or to use the decree of searching rights, the limitation of float volume, or technical platform to force the trading party to accept other products or services. These are clearly indicated as a violation as an abusive behavior. Of course, discriminatory treatment is also mentioned in this regulation for platform economy, particularly if it is based on big data, algorithm, and also analysis, particularly of a consumer regarding its consumption behavior, consumption preference, so that gave such a consumer different price, normally very high, or different trading terms, which could be rigid. And this is a very typical discriminative behavior under the regulation. Of course, using different algorithm, different formula, different standard to impose different paying terms or trading term, that is also a violation. So we could see that with the very typical or very familiar abusive behavior, we have development in quite some regulations, especially the platform economy antitrust regulation. The cases I mentioned, quite a couple of cases are listed out here. The first one is in April this year, Summer punished Alibaba Group for abusing its dominant market position in the market of online retail platform services in China and committing choosing one from two, who is imposed finally a fine of RMB 18.2 billion. And this page of a PPT gave the summary of all the elements that the authority has looked at. First of all, regarding relevant market, the market is defined as an online retail platform service market, and regional market, geographic market is China. And also the position was established with consideration of the following factor. First of all, high market share, and high HHI and the CR4, and strong power to control the relevant market, both the price and sales channels. And of course, the platform has very strong financial resources and advanced technology, technical capability, and other business operators highly depend on such a platform. And it has the high entrance barriers in the market for e-commerce, especially advantage of in related markets, the surrounding markets, and the abusive conduct has been identified as to have prohibited business operators using Alibaba's platform from operating stores on other competing platforms. And have prohibited business operator using Alibaba's platform from participating in promotions, the promotions given by other competing platforms, and also have taken various rewards or punitive measures to ensure the implementation of choosing one out of two. And then, of course, the decision of the fines is actually valued on the domestic sales, the year total domestic sales, which is up to 4%, and result in the 8.2 billion RMB. Lastly, regarding the merger filing, the anti-monopoly law enforcement authority gradually become mature, directly facing the characteristic of China's economy, the historical problems and difficulty in the emerging economy has been dealt in a very professional way. Even before the antitrust law was enacted 2008, there has been the FedEx acquisition of Kinko's, who has already been filed before the authority. That was under the different regulations. So the merger filing system is actually established long before the anti-monopoly law enacted in China. And of course, the simplified procedures, filing thresholds, and filing documents have been specified, developed, and established gradually. We also see the authorities have developed very positive law enforcement act pattern by conditionally approved, by prohibited, by also penalizing failure to file. Of course, there are also very noticeable development in the authorities' law enforcement activities, such as the notifiability of a VIE structure. Those who are familiar with the China business operator concentration cases are fully aware that the VIE structure is a very particular China issue. For those companies, especially the early days, the internet companies, they can't get their company big enough to qualify for listing in China. They went out to offshore market. However, the business they are engaging are not permissive of.
Mrs. Ding, you have 5 minutes left. It's okay.
Okay, I'll wrap up early. Okay, so okay, so I would say that there are China-specific issues. Then this is a threshold. Nowadays, is still depending on the turnover. So it's not very high. Then it's quite easy to catch even middle-sized cases. Of course, this chart shows that the merger filing before Chinese authorities increased year by year, and also the failure to notify that has been investigated and penalized has also increased. And the merger filing in platform economy, except all those factors I have mentioned regarding behavior rules, for merger filing in platform economy, those startup enterprises or emerging platforms, which may not hit the threshold of revenue, but may be still subject to the discretional scrutiny by the authorities. And those platform operation mode is a free or low prices or highly concentrated market or limited number of competitors, may also cause the attention of the authorities for its discretional scrutiny. Then I'll stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ning. It was a very complete and very interesting lecture. We discovered how your different IML entities merge into one authority to be more efficient, and how the fight against horizontal and vertical monopolies, abuse of domain positions, and also mergers issue. So before starting a Q&A session with the audience here, I will just let the president of the CNES leave for a short press conference. Donc, avant de passer à une session de...
Before moving to Q&A session for the two speakers, Madam Ning and Mr. Capobianco, I will give the opportunity to the head of the CNAS, the president of the CNAS, for press conference with the journalists, and we carry on with our sessions with our speakers. Thank you. I would like to know if there are any questions for Madam Ning and Mr. Capobianco. Please raise your hand.
The audience, if there are any questions. There, we have one.
Good morning. Thank you for both presenters. This is a very informative presentation. I'm Ismail Shukran, the president of the U.S. Algeria Business Council. I have just a question starting for both presenters. Should we create a regulation about limiting mergers? Because when you see a large corporation acquiring an SME, and it is basically the pathway directly to monopoly, which can end up with a decrease of growth, and at the same time to have playing a big role in the pricing. And we saw that examples in California in some sectors where they end up in a large monopoly. So the question is, should be a strict regulation in terms of mergers? How should they limit the mergers, or should they have a strict regulation?
Thank you, Mr. Chiron.
Would you like me to go first?
Actually, I don't hear the question clearly. It's a little bit on and off on my side. But it's can you repeat the question in summary so that I understand is that given the situation that the giant are being formed after merger or acquisition, then do we need to be actively intervene from the legislative or law enforcement aspect into such a merger? Is that the question? I actually didn't get it clear.
Yeah, I think the question was about merger and how strict the regulation should be around this particular activity, because it can also be restrictive for the economy. So how do you put the cursor when you treat this specific issue of mergers?
I'll try to answer this question because this is a question of the difficulty. Not only, I don't say it because of as a diplomatic way, but it is a real difficulty because especially given the pandemic situation, recovery and the restore the consumption and the work and the production is very important. Well, this may leave big giant the chances to acquire small, medium companies in economic difficulties. It may be good for the small and medium companies to be financially better off in a way, but with particular those industries which has represent the future market with the new economy feature, then probably conditions shall be placed to ensure the competition is not severely restricted or damaged after such a transaction. But that is really a very fine work to be done from the authority perspective. I'll pause here.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if Mr. Capobianco has an answer or two.
Yes, of course. Clearly, merger control is a key pillar of any competition law. We know that competition can be restricted by behaviors of firms, and we talked about cartels, abuse of dominance. Susan mentioned all the experience from China. And that is where competition authorities do need to intervene, and do actually intervene in many jurisdictions through their merger control powers. Now, the question alluded to recent debates and discussions about acquisitions of startups, of small firms, SMEs, and these are called in the jargon killer acquisition. That is, acquiring a potential future competitor to avoid that it becomes the threat in the future. So large digital platforms acquiring small startups who could be developing products that could challenge their market position, their market power in the future. Now, there is a big debate about how you identify these killer acquisitions, how do you assess them, because actually the complexity of merger control is about predicting the future. You are looking at a transaction today, and you're trying to establish how competition will change in the future, which is not easy. It's it's like looking in the crystal ball. So there have been a number of discussions about how to make sure that these transactions, these killer acquisitions, these acquisitions by large firms of smaller competitors, especially potential competitors, would arise in the scrutiny of competition authorities, and now to assess them. Now, that is a complex answer. Like Susan was saying, we would need more than 5 minutes to do that. But this is something that is not an issue only in small jurisdictions, but also in large jurisdictions. And some jurisdictions are changing the criteria for notification of these transactions to make sure that competition authority can review them.
Thank you very much for your answers. I will just see if there are any other questions. There's one there.
Bonjour.
Good morning. I'm Madam Kharshi Iman from Sanat Khak. My question is for Mr. Antonio. You have already mentioned about efficient tools to promote competition in public procurement. We have talked about the putting of the specs to reduce the expectation between competitors. The second question about the specs: can we consider that are we going to the antitrust? So does it encourage the competition, or should it have more problems or difficulties to encourage the market?
So I don't know if you have the translation, or I can summarize.
Yeah, if you can summarize it, because the translation wasn't clear to me. What is the specs? That was mentioning specs is specifications in public procurement. Is that what the question is?
Exactly. So we have a representative of Sonatrach, the national oil company, and she's asking which tools are efficient in tenders and which will not make agreement between companies easier, and also she's asking about the process of lots. I don't know how to translate it. I mean, how can you segment a tender in a way that will avoid the agreement between companies?
Understood. So first question, you would need a long answer, because of course promoting competition in public tenders depends on a variety of factors. First and most important one is the number of bidders. So you should design tenders to attract as many genuine bidders as possible, because that's what brings competition in the tender process. If you only have two bidders or even only a single bidder, that's very hard to have a competitive price. If you have 4, 5, 6 or more bidders, that will facilitate competition. So there are ways in which you can do that by reducing the cost of bidding, by simplifying participation, by using electronic bidding systems. Everything that facilitates participation is good. The other thing you should avoid in a tender process is opportunities for bidders to collude. That is sharing information about who else is bidding, for example, because that would allow a bidder to contact its competitors in that particular contract, in that particular tender, and potentially collude. So transparency in the tender process itself is something very, very, very sensitive. The second question, was about, remind me, I've lost.
It's in the tender process. How do you recommend to segment it in a way that will?
Yes. So lots. So we have. This is a sort of I would say schizophrenic recommendations to contracting authorities. In general, to avoid collusion, you will need to increase incentives to compete. So the larger the contract, the more valuable the contract is, the higher the incentive to win, to bid for, to win the contract, so not to collude. Because if you lose the tender, you lose a big contract. So in many circumstances, to promote competition, we have recommended to consolidate contract opportunities, to aggregate them, consolidate them. However, if you have your objective as a contracting authority is to improve participation by SMEs, for example, small and medium enterprises who cannot bid because they don't have the capacity to bid for large contract, then you want to split the contract in several lots. Now, how do you do that without increasing incentives to collude? First of all, the lot should be different. A large lot as opposed to a small lot. Second advice would be to have more lots than bidders. If you have 2 lots for 2 bidders, they will more easily allocate those lots. If you have 10 lots for 6 bidders, they will be competing for those lots. So there are ways in which you can promote more competition through lots design. So different lots, different value, different size, and more lots than the bidders that you have.
Thank you very much. Before starting with the next speaker, I have a last question for Mrs. Ning. With your experience, are there some sectors that are most likely to know monopolies?
Sorry, I didn't get it. I can't hear you well.
So the question is, are there some sectors more likely to see more monopolies emerge?
I didn't hear well, but there are special sectors that is a focus of law enforcement in China. Is that the question?
Sorry?
Yeah, I think your question is, if there are any particular sectors in China that we are focusing on the law enforcement, is that the question?
Yes, you can. Yes, that. I mean, which sector know the most concentration naturally?
Well, which sector are the mostly concentrated sector in China? Well, petroleum, if I may say, the power sector, which involves a heavy, like a telecommunication, which involves a heavy investment. Of course, the e-platform, the e-commerce platform, it's a very competing market, but we do have major giants who are in a position after like a fierce competition, in a position to be called giants, not only in China. We also see some of the industries for heavy machinery, where again it involves high investment, heavy investment. That could be also highly concentrated in a way. But I have stopped here because it seems that I'm talking about the state-owned enterprise concentrated area. I'll stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answers, Mrs. Ning. So now we will move to the next speaker. It's Mrs. Evelyn Amey, a lawyer in both Brussels and Madrid. She will give us an overview about the European Union experience in monopolies policies. So, Mrs. Evelyn, you're here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
From Madrid. Bonjour à tous. So I will speak about the experience of the European Union in competition law and policy. But I think that it would be good to change a little bit and have this session maybe in French to change also because I'm Belgian, so French is easier for me. But you can do questions in any language you want, or more or less any language that you want. So I'll...
Okay, c'est bon pour le français. On fera peut-être un petit résumé pour les autres.
Yes, we can. You can speak French. We will also explain, provide translation for the other speakers or English-speaking attendees.
Ok, parfait. Je vais commencer. Voilà, l'expérience de l'Union européenne en matière de lutte contre les monopoles. Donc, la lutte contre le monopole est très importante et je pense, tel que l'a dit le président de la Knesset ce matin, cette lutte est indispensable pour une bonne économie, telle que l'ont également souligné Monsieur Capobianco et Madame Ning. Cette lutte est donc un moteur de l'économie saine. Tel que l'a dit le président ce matin, pour une économie saine en Algérie, il est important de protéger le producteur et le consommateur, et cela se passe à travers une application du droit de la concurrence. Quels sont les bénéfices? Comme il a déjà été souligné, ça donne une suffisance de produits, par exemple, suffisamment de produits sur le marché, des marchés à des prix et une qualité bien meilleure. Ça donne aussi beaucoup plus de place à l'innovation, donc ce n'a que des bénéfices. Avant que je vous explique donc le droit de la concurrence dans l'Union européenne, je souhaite signaler que l'application du droit de la concurrence en Europe est très très similaire à celui qui a été appliqué jusqu'à présent en Algérie. Donc il y a en Europe il s'articule en 3 matières. Donc il y a les pratiques restrictives, les fusions et acquisitions et les aides d'État. En Algérie, vous avez dans la constitution algérienne l'article 43 qui dit que les monopoles sont interdits. Donc après, en Algérie, il y a les pratiques restrictives et les fusions et acquisitions, et logiquement, il n'y a pas les aides d'État, parce que dans les pays européens, dans chaque pays, dans chaque régime de concurrence nationale, il n'y a pas besoin de trop pousser sur l'aspect aide d'État. Par exemple, le droit de la concurrence en Espagne n'a pas cette la matière d'aide d'État. Il y a des recommandations en aide d'État, mais il n'y a pas d'obligation en ce qui concerne les aides d'État. Avant que je ne continue, donc j'aimerais quand même exprimer mes respects au travail qui a été fait par le Conseil de la concurrence, pour lequel j'ai eu l'honneur de travailler en 2018. Messieurs Zitouni, messieurs Slimani et messieurs Krogli, et puis surtout exprimer mes respects à messieurs Asli et Medjahed qui nous ont quittés cet été à cause de la pandémie. Donc voilà. Maintenant, je vais vous expliquer un petit peu les trois aspects du droit de la concurrence en Europe. Donc nous avons la lutte contre les monopoles ex post. Donc ça veut dire une fois qu'il y a déjà des monopoles, on va essayer de s'en défaire grâce à la lutte contre les pratiques restrictives. Les pratiques restrictives, c'est surtout les ententes, mais il y a aussi des pratiques restrictives entre d'autres niveaux de marché. Après, je vous expliquerai en plus de détails. Mais donc ça, c'est ex post. On va essayer de lutter contre des monopoles qui sont déjà en place, après coup. Le second volet, ce sont les fusions et acquisitions. Donc là, c'est ex ante. Donc, on va essayer d'éviter qu'il y ait des monopoles qui naissent dans l'économie. Là, il y a un régime de contrôle de concentration. C'est quoi une concentration? C'est une fusion, une acquisition, ou ça peut aussi être la création d'une entreprise en commun. Donc une joint venture. Donc nous avons ces deux volets qui sont également présents en Algérie, et puis le troisième volet qui n'existe pas dans les régimes nationaux de concurrence, ou à très faible taux, et ça, ce sont les aides d'État. Donc pour éviter également qu'il y ait des monopoles à niveau européen, en Europe, nous avons aussi une réglementation d'aide d'État, pour éviter surtout qu'un État aide plutôt ses propres entreprises au détriment des entreprises des autres États européens. Donc voilà, donc nous avons trois volets en Europe, et le premier volet, c'est les pratiques restrictives. Donc il y a des pratiques restrictives sans position dominante, et puis les pratiques restrictives avec une position dominante. Sans position dominante, c'est l'article 101 du traité du fonctionnement de l'Union européenne, et avec une position dominante, c'est l'article 102 du traité du fonctionnement de l'Union européenne. Donc les pratiques restrictives sans position dominante, ce sont surtout les accords restrictifs et les échanges d'informations sensibles entre une entreprise et ses clients, ses fournisseurs ou ses concurrents. Donc, il faut un accord. C'est un élément très important, parce que l'accord en matière de concurrence est un concept très ample. Donc nous avons des accords écrits, où un concurrent dit avec l'autre, voilà, on va se diviser le marché. Vous prenez le sud du pays, par exemple, il y a eu longtemps au Portugal, c'est encore le cas, mais maintenant c'est parce que les goûts au Portugal ont changé à cause d'un cartel. Il y avait une entente comme quoi la bière dans le nord du pays, c'était une marque de bière, et dans le sud du pays, c'était une autre marque de bière. Et maintenant, évidemment, les consommateurs n'ont plus l'habitude d'acheter autre chose, donc ce cartel, même s'il n'existe plus, a modelé un petit peu l'environnement économique. Mais il n'y a pas uniquement un accord écrit, ça peut aussi être un accord verbal. Par exemple, j'ai eu un cas comme ça, d'une entente entre deux producteurs de plastique espagnols. C'était dans un cartel européen où toutes les entreprises de plastique, au niveau européen, s'étaient mis d'accord pour fixer les prix et diviser, se partager le marché. Alors il n'y avait pas entre les deux entreprises espagnoles qui participaient au cartel européen, il n'y avait pas d'accord écrit. Mais, comme tout bon businessman espagnol, le business s'était fait autour d'un bon repas, le midi, et donc un des deux directeurs d'entreprise avait pris une serviette en papier du restaurant, où il avait marqué, voilà, Galicia pour toi, Catalunya pour moi, Andalusia pour toi. Et donc, du coup, il y avait un partage du marché du plastique espagnol qui qui n'était pas un contrat écrit, mais une serviette en papier d'un restaurant, que le directeur de l'entreprise avait bien gardé dans le tiroir de son bureau. Et lors d'une inspection qui a été faite par la Commission européenne avec l'aide de l'autorité espagnole, cette serviette a été retrouvée et a été la preuve d'un cartel. Donc, c'est pour vous expliquer que l'accord est un concept très ample. Ça ne doit pas être un accord écrit où tout le monde signe, bien daté, etc. Non, il est suffisant d'avoir un accord verbal ou d'avoir suffisamment de preuves ou d'indices qui montrent qu'il y a un accord verbal. Alors, quelque chose d'encore plus dilué qu'un accord, qui peut être possible, c'est une pratique concertée. Une pratique concertée, ce n'est pas un vrai accord, mais, par exemple, je vous explique quand, dans le cartel des shampoings, il y a eu un cartel à niveau européen des shampoings. Alors, les producteurs de bouteilles de shampoing s'étaient mis d'accord d'augmenter le prix du shampoing. Quand les autorités remarquent que tous les prix des shampoings commencent à augmenter, il est évidemment très très difficile pour une autorité de la concurrence de prouver, déjà de détecter ce type de cartel, mais en plus de prouver qu'il y a un accord qui fait que tous les producteurs de shampoing fixent leur prix à 1 euro en plus. C'est très très difficile. Donc après, souvent, il y a des espèces de statistiques qui sont faites, mais ce ne sont que des indices qui après requièrent plus d'inspection afin d'arriver à une base de données, une base de preuves suffisamment solide pour pouvoir pincer le cartel. Alors en plus, les producteurs et les entreprises sont en Europe, elles connaissent très très bien le droit de la concurrence, surtout les multinationales. Qu'est-ce qu'elles avaient fait dans le cartel des shampoings pour que ce ne soit encore plus difficile à détecter? Au lieu d'augmenter le prix d'1 euro, ce qu'elles avaient fait, elles avaient diminué le volume des bouteilles de shampoing. Encore beaucoup plus difficile parce que pour le même prix, donc chacun avait son propre prix, un prix différent, donc on ne pouvait pas voir qu'il y avait une alignation des prix, mais tous s'étaient mis d'accord que les bouteilles de 250 ml allaient devenir, à partir du 1er janvier, des bouteilles de 240 ml. Et donc, du coup, pour le même prix, tous les consommateurs achetaient des bouteilles un peu moins grandes et personne ne s'en est aperçu pendant des années, jusqu'à ce que la politique de délation est arrivée en Europe, ce qui veut dire que quand on est dans un cartel, il ne faut plus se fier les uns des autres parce qu'un des membres, une des entreprises du cartel peut aller à l'autorité de la concurrence, à la Commission européenne ou à l'autorité nationale, dire voilà, je fais partie d'un cartel et je suis vraiment désolée, mais je vais lui donner les noms de tous les autres. C'est très vilain. Pendant longtemps en Espagne, on disait impossible ici, nous sommes un pays catholique, personne ne va faire ça, nous avons des valeurs de l'éthique. Et pourtant, le premier jour de l'entrée en vigueur de la politique de délation en 2011, si je me rappelle bien, il y avait une rangée, et moi j'en faisais partie, d'avocats de la concurrence, d'entreprises qui voulaient délater ou ce qui s'appelle le whistleblowing en anglais, d'autres entreprises qui participaient à un cartel. Donc voilà, donc c'est une politique aussi qui marche très bien, la politique des délations. Parce que les uns vont donc faire un peu les policiers des autres et c'est très très efficace afin de détecter ces cartels où il n'y a pas d'accord. Les cartels bien faits, ils sont plus faciles à détecter grâce à la politique des délations. Après, il y a la clémence, évidemment. Celui qui va en premier aura l'immunité totale d'une sanction, et les sanctions sont très hautes. 10% du chiffre d'affaires de l'année précédente, c'est quand même assez haut. En Algérie, en plus, c'est 12%, donc c'est encore plus haut. Alors, il y a d'un côté les pratiques restrictives sans position dominante, et après, il y a les pratiques restrictives avec une position dominante, mais j'en parlerai un peu plus tard en détail. Les pratiques restrictives, quelles sont les sanctions? Comme je l'ai déjà dit, il y a des sanctions financières d'abord, jusqu'à 10% du chiffre d'affaires, ce qui est énorme. Et puis, il y a aussi le fait que les accords sont nuls et non avenants. Ce qui veut dire que, comme ça ne prescrit pas tout de suite, il est possible qu'un cartel soit condamné 4 ans après qu'il ait commencé, et donc tous les contrats, toute l'exécution qui s'est faite de tous les contrats des entreprises qui se sont faites durant les 4 ans seront nuls et non avenants, ce qui a finalement des conséquences juridiques très très lourdes pour tout ce qui a eu attrait à ces entreprises pendant longtemps. Après, il y a aussi, déjà en Europe, il y a beaucoup de ça pour l'instant, ça vient aussi des États-Unis, comme la délation, c'est l'indemnisation des dommages aux victimes. L'Europe n'a pas encore je dirais une culture de litigation comme il y a aux États-Unis, où toutes les victimes vont tout de suite commencer à demander les entreprises pour des abus de position dominante ou pour des cartels qui leur aient causé des dommages, mais ça commence quand même à venir, et maintenant il y a de plus en plus donc, de victimes. Par exemple, l'association de producteurs de shampoing irait le jour d'aujourd'hui devant le juge espagnol ou devant le juge belge et lui dirait, voilà, nous, association, nous avons plein tous les consommateurs ont été lésés, et donc nous demandons des dommages et des intérêts aux grands producteurs de shampoing, ou par exemple le grand producteur de dentifrice, etc. C'est plus difficile quand c'est vraiment à niveau des consommateurs, c'est plus facile quand c'est plus haut dans la chaîne, où c'est par exemple les producteurs de vitamines qui ont produit des vitamines, qui les ont vendues, parce que les vitamines, il y a presque dans tout, il y a dans les céréales, il y a dans la nourriture pour animaux, etc. Donc quand les grandes entreprises de céréales type Nestlé vont demander des dommages et intérêts aux grands producteurs de vitamines, là, c'est beaucoup plus facile parce qu'on a une demande d'une multinationale assez forte. Et donc, ça commence à fonctionner en Europe. Donc, il y a de plus en plus de demandes de dommages et intérêts aux entreprises qui ont enfreint le droit de la concurrence. Qu'est-ce que nous avons encore? La responsabilité personnelle des directeurs, civile ou pénale. Ça, il n'y a pas à niveau européen, mais je tiens quand même à le souligner parce que dans beaucoup de régimes de la concurrence à niveau national en Europe, il y a une responsabilité civile ou pénale des directeurs d'entreprises ayant participé dans des infractions du droit de la concurrence. Par exemple, en Irlande, il y a eu beaucoup de directeurs d'entreprises qui ont fini en prison pendant des années pour des infractions en droit de la concurrence. Alors, il y a aussi le préjudice à l'image et la presse. Par exemple, s'il y a un abus de position dominante par Microsoft, comme il y a eu, c'est le fait que c'est détecté par la Commission européenne et tout fait en sorte que tout de suite ça va vers la presse, et donc c'est quand même très mauvais pour la réputation des grandes entreprises et des petites entreprises aussi, mais ils font moins l'objet de presse. Surtout quand l'entreprise est cotée en bourse, parce que là, la valeur de l'entreprise aussi descend. Et donc, c'est très important aussi pour le côté financier de l'entreprise. Et finalement, il y a les frais, il y a les avocats, les déclarations à la presse, etc. Voilà. Donc, nous avons déjà parlé des pratiques restrictives sans position dominante. Je vous ai expliqué ce que c'était. Le commissaire européen de 2002, Mario Monti, a dit une phrase qui est assez vraie. Les cartels sont un cancer pour l'économie du marché qui constitue la base de notre communauté. Donc en Europe, c'est très important de lutter contre les cartels. Les pratiques restrictives peuvent être des accords horizontaux. Ça veut dire des accords entre des concurrents, comme je vous le marque ici, au même niveau du marché. Par exemple, Coca-Cola et Pepsi peuvent décider demain, moyennant un accord qui peut être un accord verbal, comme je vous ai dit, ou un accord écrit, même sans accord, décider de fixer les prix du Coca-Cola demain ou de se répartir le marché. Mais ça peut aussi être un accord vertical. Un accord vertical, ça veut dire un accord entre des entreprises qui opèrent à différents niveaux du marché. Donc, qui ne sont pas des entreprises concurrentes. Par exemple, Coca-Cola peut imposer, ce serait une infraction du marché, le prix de revente au supermarché. Mettons un supermarché en Algérie, le supermarché Uno. Donc, ce que Coca-Cola peut faire, c'est imposer son prix de vente à Uno. Ce qu'il ne peut pas faire, c'est imposer le prix auquel Uno va revendre à son tour le Coca-Cola aux consommateurs de Sidi Mohamed. Donc, c'est très important aussi qu'il peut y avoir des accords verticaux qui sont contraires au droit de la concurrence. Alors, nous avons aussi les pratiques restrictives avec une position dominante. Ça, c'est l'article 102 du traité du fonctionnement de l'Union européenne. Là, c'est quand il y a une entreprise avec une position dominante qui abuse de sa position dominante et enfreint donc la libre concurrence. Alors, très important de savoir qu'il y a deux éléments clés à un abus de position dominante. Et très important aussi de savoir que la position dominante en soi, et ça c'est important pour les monopoles par exemple étatiques, la position dominante en soi n'est pas une infraction, en Europe en tout cas, et en Algérie pour l'instant aussi. Donc la position dominante n'est pas une infraction. Ce qui constitue l'infraction, c'est l'abus de la position dominante. Alors, la position dominante, c'est pas non plus une formule mathématique. Ça veut dire quoi, la position dominante? Ça veut dire quoi? D'habitude, on dit c'est plus ou moins autour de 40%. Mais, dans le régime européen, on peut avoir une position dominante avec moins de 40%. 40% est plus ou moins la règle générale. Mais ce qui est important, c'est qu'il s'agit d'une entreprise qui est tout à fait indépendante, qui opère sur le marché de façon indépendante. Elle s'en fout des clients, elle s'en fout des fournisseurs, elle s'en fout des concurrents. Sa stratégie économique et commerciale, elle peut la définir de façon tout à fait indépendante. Et ça, c'est d'habitude quand on a 40% ou plus. Mais ça peut aussi être quand on a moins de 40%. Donc tout dépend un peu du marché. Donc c'est pas quelque chose de mathématique. Mais mettons, 40% est une bonne règle de base. Alors, évidemment, quand on dit 40%, mais 40% de quoi? Très important, c'est le marché. Le marché, parce que 40% de quoi? Moi, je suis un producteur de bananes, comme dans le fameux cas United Brands. Si je ne produis que des bananes, je peux avoir 90%, 90%, donc 90% du marché des bananes, si le marché est défini comme le marché de la banane. Mais si le marché est défini comme le marché des fruits frais, vu que je ne produis que des bananes, il est possible que je ne sois pas dominante, que je n'ai que 20%. Donc la définition du marché des produits est très très importante. La définition, donc ici dans le cas United Brands, devant la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne, il y avait un producteur de bananes qui était dominant, United Brands, et c'était pas le problème, comme je vous ai dit, il n'est pas dans sa dominance. Le marché était défini comme le marché de la banane, et ce qui était important, donc quand la Cour de justice a dit ce marché, c'est le marché de la banane, United Brands, vous avez une position dominante. Donc l'infraction n'était pas le fait d'avoir une position dominante, mais le fait d'abuser de cette position dominante. Donc quel était l'abus? L'abus était le fait que United Brands refusait de vendre des bananes à un distributeur danois dans l'Union européenne. L'abus, c'était le refus de vente par la dominante. Alors, ce qui est très important aussi, donc le marché relevant ou pertinent, c'est d'un côté le marché des produits, de l'autre côté aussi le marché géographique. Donc le marché géographique, je vous explique. Je suis un producteur de camions français, j'ai 80% du marché en France, donc je suis dominant en France. Mais, très important, comment est-ce qu'on définit le marché? Si le marché est défini comme étant le marché des camions européens, il est possible que je ne sois pas dominant, j'ai 30% du marché européen. Ou si on définit encore plus le marché comme étant le marché mondial, je n'ai que 10% ou 5%, je me dilue tout à fait parce que les Chinois, ils produisent beaucoup plus de camions. Donc j'ai peut-être 1%, donc très important. Ce qui est clé dans les pratiques restrictives, c'est de pouvoir bien définir le marché. C'est moins important pour les ententes, mais c'est très important surtout pour l'abus de position dominante. Alors, quel est l'abus? L'abus peut être, par exemple, vous n'avez pas parlé, par exemple, le marché, avant d'aller vers les abus, donc le marché géographique peut être mondial, il peut être régional, donc ça peut être l'Europe, ça peut être le Maghreb, par exemple, dans le cas de l'Algérie, ou ça peut être national, mais ça peut être encore plus petit. Donc on a eu un cas aussi à la Cour de justice où le port de la ville de Gênes en Italie était le marché géographique en soi. Parce que l'autorité portuaire avait 100% du marché, le marché du port, parce qu'elle avait des droits exclusifs. Alors, le fait que l'autorité portuaire avait 100% du marché n'est pas un problème, à nouveau. Quel est le problème? Le problème est quand on abuse de cette position dominante. Et que faisait l'autorité portuaire? Elle obligeait les déchargeurs, les entreprises qui déchargeaient au port de Gênes, à décharger avec des infrastructures du port de Gênes et pas avec leur propre infrastructure. Donc, elle faisait une espèce de vente liée. Si vous voulez décharger dans votre port, ok, mais vous ne pouvez pas le faire avec vos propres moyens. Vous devez le faire avec mes moyens. Et donc là, elle se faisait des bénéfices. Et ça a été vu comme étant abusif. Alors, quels sont d'autres abus? Par exemple, l'exclusion de concurrents. Par exemple, le refus d'accès. Le cas par excellence, c'est Microsoft. Microsoft a été condamné tant aux États-Unis comme dans l'Union européenne, mais il y a eu, dans l'Union européenne, on parlait de 500 millions d'euros, mais il y a eu un accord à l'amiable, un settlement, des remèdes, et donc, entre Microsoft et la partie qui s'était plaignée, Sun Microsystems, et donc il n'y a pas eu finalement ça a été fini à l'amiable. Et donc ce qui est très important là-bas, c'est donc Microsoft avait une position dominante dans le marché des systèmes opératifs de PC, et elle abusait, donc ça c'était pas un problème non plus, donc Microsoft elle peut avoir toute la dominance qu'elle veut dans les marchés qu'elle veut, mais le problème c'est qu'elle abusait sur le marché connexe des logiciels de médias. Alors c'est quoi les logiciel de médias, c'est le software qu'on utilise pour utiliser la musique et les films. Donc, quand on achetait un PC de Microsoft, il y avait automatiquement le Windows Media Player qui était installé par défaut. Aujourd'hui, Microsoft ne fait plus ça. Donc, Microsoft vend le PC et après, on peut mettre dedans le Media Player, un logiciel pour écouter la musique ou écouter des films qu'on veut. Donc, parce que c'est un marché à part. Donc, c'est très important de bien voir quel est l'abus. Ça peut être aussi, par exemple, l'exploitation de clients, par exemple des prix excessifs. Un cas connu, c'est Hoffmann-La-Roche, où Hoffmann-La-Roche donnait des réductions de fidélité aux clients s'ils achetaient tous leurs besoins en vitamines. Donc, c'est le fameux cartel des vitamines dont je vous parlais avant. Donc, si tous les besoins en vitamines étaient achetés auprès d'Hoffmann-La-Roche, c'était bon. Mais il fallait acheter toute la gamme. On ne pouvait pas juste dire, voilà, moi je veux des vitamines A ou des vitamines C. Non, il fallait acheter tout. Donc ça aussi, c'est un abus. Voilà. Alors, un second volet. Ah oui, avant que je continue là-dessus, juste dire, en Europe, les monopoles d'État, là, on fait une différenciation.
Amen. Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Je dois abréger?
You need to finish your presentation between 5 and 10 minutes. You have only 5.
Thank you. All right. Donc, je vais juste vous dire les monopoles d'État. Là, en Europe, on fait une différenciation entre l'activité commerciale et les services généraux d'intérêt économique. L'activité commerciale sont traitées comme des entreprises, donc il y a une application du droit de la concurrence. Les services généraux d'intérêt économique, là, il y a une exception. Il n'y a pas d'application du droit de la concurrence. Donc, c'est quoi ces services généraux d'intérêt économique? Là, on interprète de façon restrictive. Par exemple, une autorité aéroportuaire, elle fait plein d'activités commerciales, mais quand on parle de sécurité aérienne, de la tour de contrôle, là, évidemment, le droit de la concurrence ne s'applique pas. Alors maintenant, je vais vous parler rapidement en 2 minutes du ex ante, donc le contrôle de la concurrence ex ante, donc les fusions et les acquisitions, comme je vous ai dit avant, le contrôle des concentrations. Donc, il faut un changement de contrôle entre les entreprises, donc un changement de l'influence décisive de la stratégie d'entreprise. Ça peut être une fusion, une acquisition, une joint venture. 2, il faut que certains seuils soient atteints, donc seuil de chiffre d'affaires mondial ou un seuil de chiffre d'affaires européen, afin qu'il faille notifier à la Commission européenne la fusion, l'acquisition, la joint venture. Et 3, il faut notifier les opérations de concentration pour que la Commission européenne puisse faire une analyse et voir s'il y aura un monopole qui va être créé, oui ou non. Alors, les sanctions, s'il n'y a pas de notification, c'est plus ou moins la même chose que dans les pratiques restrictives. Voilà. Seule chose qui est très importante, qu'il n'y a pas en Algérie, mais oui, à niveau européen, c'est très important, et ça fait très peur aux entreprises, c'est que quand une concentration n'a pas été notifiée et elle a enfreint le droit de la concurrence, après, quand la Commission européenne le remarque, il faut qu'elle défasse toute la nouvelle entité fusionnée. Donc, il y a des travailleurs qui ont été cédés, par exemple, lors d'une acquisition. Il y a plein de choses qui ont été faites et qui doivent être tout à fait défaites. Donc ça fait très, très peur aux entreprises. Alors voilà, le marché, je pense que je vous ai expliqué plus ou moins comment fonctionne. Donc, très important, la définition du marché. Voilà. Donc, le marché peut être par exemple ici, très, très ample, mais peut-être aussi moins ample. Ça, c'est une présentation que j'avais donnée avant la pandémie en Algérie, pour expliquer donc la définition des marchés. Donc je vous laisse lire ça parce que je pense qu'il est mieux d'abréger. Et donc la définition des marchés, n'empêche, est très très important, surtout le jour d'aujourd'hui. Je reviens vers la définition de marché parce qu'il y a de plus en plus de multi-sided markets. Donc il n'y a plus le marché traditionnel avec l'Internet. Donc je vends quelque chose en ligne, oui, mais ce n'est plus si simple, ce n'est plus noir et blanc parce que je vends en ligne, mais finalement je me fais beaucoup d'argent avec les simples clics des gens. Donc quand on clique, quand on voit la publicité, donc les marchés sont très très compliqués le jour d'aujourd'hui. C'est pas uniquement, voilà, je vends des yaourts à boire ou des yaourts à manger. Est-ce que le marché est un marché des yaourts à boire ou un marché des yaourts à manger? Le jour d'aujourd'hui, c'est beaucoup plus complexe que ça avec l'Internet. Donc je pense que la définition du marché devient de plus en plus importante. Alors, le troisième volet que nous avons aussi en Europe, parce que, évidemment, on ne veut pas que, par exemple, l'Allemagne favorise en donnant de l'argent, des aides d'État, ses propres entreprises, tandis que le Portugal veut faire de la concurrence. Il ne peut pas, parce que l'Allemagne donne plein d'argent, par exemple, à ses propres entreprises. Il y a les aides d'État dans l'Union européenne, comme nous sommes plusieurs États. Nous ne voulons pas qu'il y a des aides d'État évidemment compatibles et pas compatibles. Donc les incompatibles doivent être notifiés à la Commission européenne et après, si elles sont déclarées incompatibles, elles doivent être remboursées. Mais évidemment, il y a des aides d'État compatibles, des régionales pour les pays du Sud avant, comme l'Espagne qui était pauvre avant, mais maintenant plus. Les pays de l'Est, au début, aussi des aides d'État, ou par exemple l'aide pour la réunification de l'Allemagne. Longtemps, pour aider la réunification de l'Allemagne, il y avait des aides d'État qui étaient compatibles. Ou par exemple, quand Airbus a voulu faire son super jumbo de 800 personnes pour concurrencer avec le Boeing jumbo jet des Américains, évidemment, l'Union européenne a décidé que c'était une aide d'État compatible. Donc voilà, là il y a un peu plus de discrétion. Alors voilà, les instances, et là je vais finir avec ça. Donc les instances, nous avons la DG Comp, la Commission européenne, que vous voyez à votre gauche. Après, les décisions de la DG Comp peuvent être recourues devant la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne. Là, vous me voyez tout à fait en bas avec mon collègue Miguel Ferro. La semaine passée, où j'étais au Luxembourg, parce que les cours, donc on a première instance et seconde instance, la Cour de justice, elle se trouve au Luxembourg, mais on a aussi les autorités de la concurrence nationale et les juges nationaux. Donc là, vous voyez plusieurs autorités de la concurrence nationale et des juges nationaux qui s'occupent le jour d'aujourd'hui aussi du droit de la concurrence. Voilà. La coopération internationale, voilà, il y a plusieurs forums. Toutes les autorités nationales se réunissent de temps en temps avec la Commission européenne et entre elles, parce qu'évidemment, elles doivent être au courant de qui fait quoi. Il y a aussi la participation avec l'OCDE, mais donc l'OCDE est bien représenté ce matin ici. Il y a une coopération aussi avec les États-Unis, surtout en ce qui concerne les cartels, par exemple le cartel des vitamines, la position dominante de Microsoft, un peu moins en fusion-acquisition parce qu'il y a toujours des enjeux politiques. Donc GE, Honeywell, là, l'Union européenne et les États-Unis avaient une autre vision, mais parfois ils sont d'accord. Voilà. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Donc moi je travaille surtout donc à niveau européen, mais je travaille aussi en collaboration avec Maître Arabia pour tout ce qui est l'Algérie. Voilà, merci, au revoir. Je vais essayer de faire ça.
On issues of Algeria. So thank you very much. We have a question in the room. So you have evoked many issues in the past and cases that you dealt with in the past at DGCOM. So we would like to mention this, and we would like to see how do you work at the level of the GCOM. So do you use the jurisprudence and do you use the cases that you dealt with before as a reference, or what do you do in order to make decisions? Thank you very much.
Okay, to make this...
Morning, Riyad Boujamadi, energy expert. I would like to ask you this question because Google today has a monopoly position on all tools, especially on OS Android, where it blocked many research engines, European research engines, and many European countries have claimed about this. So how did you tackle this problem? Or how did you deal with this problem?
Yes. I guess that this is not for me to decide, but it's for the European Commission. There are many investigations into Google, both at a national level when it's only a market, because Google is not one market. Google is operating in various markets. So depending on the nature of the market, there are some investigations which have been made at national level, but there's an ongoing investigation by the European Commission. And given this ongoing investigation, I think that yesterday the Italian competition authority has decided to refer its own investigation also to the European Commission, who will then decide whether there's a dominant position. Again, the importance here is, as I said to you before, the definition of the market. That's the most important thing and the most tricky thing in these markets, as the market for Android systems, as you correctly said. So once the market is defined, then the European Commission can see whether there is a dominant position, and then the second level is whether the dominant position is being abused. So I cannot say anything more because I'm not Google's lawyer, but I know Google's lawyer. Garrigues, they are Google's lawyers, and they have many in-house lawyers too.
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture and your answers. So now we will hear Mrs. Lynn Robertson from the Oecd. She will talk more about the same concept about competition law, anti-monopolies, and the cartels laws, but in the context of emerging market, because you know that in emerging market, growth is essential, so we have to find a regulatory framework that take into account these realities. So now we will hear Mrs. Robertson, if you are here.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, je crois que ce sont mes collègues algériens qui vont s'occuper de mon présentation. Voilà, pendant qu'on attend que ça affiche. Je voudrais commencer par remercier le CNES d'avoir invité la division de la concurrence de l'OCDE à s'exprimer aujourd'hui ainsi que demain. Nous espérons que cette conférence représente le premier pas vers le développement de longue et fructueuse amitié entre l'Algérie et l'OCDE. Et puis, en fait, on a un petit projet, j'espère, lancé bientôt avec l'Algérie. Donc, voilà, mon présentation est affichée, donc on peut commencer. I was given the topic of competition in emerging markets, and I will provide you with case studies of reform in emerging economies and one or two that are not emerging economies. And I've chosen to illustrate countries that we at the OECD have worked with to identify reforms that need to be implemented based on OECD recommendations and standards. And why did I choose to take this approach? It's because not all reforms that are implemented by emerging economies are necessarily coherent with international best practices and standards, nor if we have not worked on these reforms can we guarantee the motivation behind these reforms. Were they implemented because of a vested interest from certain stakeholders, or were these reforms implemented simply as window dressing? So, but the countries we have worked with, either projects or because they have used our work, and we know the reforms that they have implemented based on our recommendations, these ones I can have confidence in. I did not want to use the work of other organizations or people because I don't necessarily know what's behind it. So let's talk about competition law and convergence. Yes, thank you. So before I start, it's just a reminder that we have approximately 150 competition authorities. These include regional authorities as well, such as COMESA, that have a competition law. There are 38 OECD member countries now. It's constantly growing. And in order to be an OECD member, you must have an enforced competition law. About 30 years ago or so, the OECD Competition Committee recognized the need for what we call convergent, for jurisdictions to share common standards and practices. And this principle of convergence is what underpins our work at the OECD Competition Committee and its engagement with non-OECD jurisdictions. Now, I mention this principle of convergence because this is what is behind the recommendations that we make to emerging economies for reform, that they adhere to the same best practices and principles that OECD member countries do. As we know, with globalization, enforcement of law has become international, and oftentimes cartels, mergers might be engage different jurisdictions. So it's important that we all have a common understanding of vocabulary and about the way competition law is enforced. Next slide, please. I talked about best practices and standards, and here are our OECD competition recommendations. Each of the policy areas that the OECD works in has a series of recommendations and standards. My colleague Antonio Campio-Bianco referred to the bid rigging recommendation and standard, and this is just one of many. We recently adopted recommendations on transparency, procedural fairness, as well as competitive neutrality, which I believe Antonio also mentioned. And we also updated our recommendation on competition assessment and effective action against hardcore cartels. When we work with non-member countries, emerging economies, and provide recommendations for reform, we are benchmarking their competition frameworks against these standards. And these are the same standards that are applied to OECD member countries as well. And this creates a coherence. And the development of these recommendations and standards was done not only in discussion with OECD members, but we engaged non-member countries, countries outside of the OECD area in the development of these recommendations and standards. And this is where we would like to engage more with Algeria, because the OECD is not all about just giving, just what we believe. We walk into a country, we tell you what to do, but we learn also from countries from outside of the OECD area. That's why it's so important for us to engage with non-OECD countries. Next slide, please. Prochaine. Thank you. So let me just repeat what Antonio said, the rationale for competition. I'm sure you all know this very well, but this is why countries will reform their competition frameworks, to ensure that they effectively enforce competition in order to meet these objectives. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges facing emerging economies, now these are not necessarily unique to emerging economies. You will see that many of them occur in OECD member countries as well. We all face challenges of explaining what competition is to our societies. We all face challenges in differentiating between consumer policy, competition policy. But what's interesting is the sum total, the number of these that appear in emerging economies. So again, as I said, it's the lack of understanding of competition, the lack of financial resources. The competition authority may lack independence in its enforcement efforts. It may receive too strict instruction from government. Oftentimes, we see very small economies with strong family ties to government and firms that are interlinked. This creates rents. It creates also a pressure, and so that democracy does not necessarily act independently. Antonio talked about regulatory barriers, and oftentimes we see, and he gave you some slides that demonstrated how high barriers raise the costs for consumers and lowers innovation. We see heavy state presence in markets, which state presence in market in itself is fine, but it's when the state presence distorts competition or they are exempt from the competition law. In some cases, there may be a very sound, rational reason why a state-owned enterprise may be exempt from competition law, but oftentimes it should not be. We also see industrial policies or economic forms that do not integrate, do not account for competition within the policies. And then, as I mentioned before, we often see a confusion between consumer policy and competition policy. And this we often see in developing and emerging economies, particularly when the competition authority carries both mandates. So many of our recommendations will address these challenges to emerging markets. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, the OECD, we carry out many projects with emerging and developing countries as well as our own member countries. And these are the case studies that I'm going to give you of some of the examples of reform and some of the lessons that perhaps Algeria can take away. These are only some of our projects. The list is very, very long. And I only also chose the most recent ones. Kazakhstan, for example, dates back a few years now. Mexico, Antonio had spoken to you about this. So let me go through just the different types of projects we run, because again, that will position for you the types of recommendations and therefore the types of reforms that emerging economies have implemented. So I realize I'm giving you a lot of background before I give you the case studies, but I felt that this was necessary to understand our type of work and why we have these recommendations. So first of all, what is the most intensive, I think, are the peer reviews of competition law and policy. I will explain what that is, but for now, these are the countries. The EAU, the Eurasian Economic Union, we're running a peer review with them. Tunisia, we just had the examination, it's ongoing. Most recent one too, Brazil, Denmark, Ecuador, El Salvador. You see it's quite a range of countries. We also carry out what would be a lighter assessment of a competition framework, and this one means that the country is not subjected to a review by its peers, but we as the Secretariat assess the competition framework, the strengths and areas for reform. We recently assessed the countries of Southeastern Europe, and now Algeria as well. I recently received funding to start a project with Algeria, which we hope to launch soon. This will be funded by the Siemens Foundation and includes an assessment of Algeria's competition framework, as well as capacity building workshops, a report, and the integration of Algeria into our CompStats database. A very similar project, it's a sister project, is also scheduled to be launched in Uzbekistan. The next type of project we carry out are the competition assessment projects. We have them running in Brazil, Tunisia. ASEAN recently completed a very, very big project there. Greece, this is the one that Antonio mentioned. We look at regulatory barriers to competition in specific sectors and how they can impede competition. This might be either by being a barrier to entry for new market players. It could also include licensing arrangements, the cost of doing business as well. And this is what we look at to how to stimulate competition within important sectors for the economy. We have run projects that examined the public procurement frameworks to help countries reduce bid rigging in public procurement, help them screen better to ensure that procurement processes, tendering processes are more competitive in order essentially to save taxpayers money. We have competition enforcement projects where we provided recommendations on merger control, such as in Chile. And we also will run market studies. For example, we're looking at one in the energy sector in Ukraine. Next slide, please. So let me just give you a little bit more detail. OECD competition law and policy peer reviews, they are a very thorough examination of a country's competition framework. So we are not just examining the work practices of the competition authority, but we're looking at the country in its entirety. So if competition is enforced by another regulator, we would look at that other regulator. We look at the judicial system. We look at the policies of the government to support competition. So we assess both the strengths, what is the country doing well, and we encourage it to continue to do so, and also where there are areas for reform. And these, as I said, are based on the OECD standards to encourage a convergence with best practices, which we have identified through our recommendations that I cited, gave you the list of earlier. And in the end, we provide recommendations for change to the competition authority and the government, because some of the change, some of the reform we recommend has to be implemented by the government in cooperation with the competition authority. This could be anything from increasing funding to the competition authority to carrying out a competition assessment of particular sectors. It could be to strengthen the judicial system, including education of judges on competition, or to create specialized courts, or it could be better cooperation between sector regulators and the competition authority. And oftentimes the competition authority are the ones who approach us to carry out these reviews, because they require the compelling arguments for reform that they can go to the government with, so that they can say that an independent, objective body who sets international standards says that we, X country like El Salvador, must do the following if we want to enforce competition better, and if we want to have a competition framework of international standards. And all of our peer reviews, we've done many now, are available online, and there's many lessons to be learned for countries who want to strengthen their competition frameworks by looking at peer reviews. Next slide, please. So now finally, let me give you a case study of reform. And I'm going to give you the case study of Peru, which I find particularly interesting because Peru has been very ambitious in revising and updating and creating a competition framework which is coherent with international standards. And Peru has become very active in the international community of competition authorities. And all of this because Peru recognizes that it does have an issue of inequality within its economy and society, its issue with poverty, and it has decided that competition is one of the policy levers, one of the strongest policy levers it can use for economic reform and to increase productivity and innovation. So we undertook the peer review in 2018. The following are reforms that have been implemented to date, 2021. 80% of the recommendations in the peer review have been implemented. For example, and these are all based on the recommendations in the peer review, we know that Indicompi has presented a bill to its Congress to establish a simplified administration proceeding for anti-monopoly cases. Peru has finally adopted a merger control law. Prior to our peer review, it did not have a merger control law, which is considered one of the key principles for a competition framework which is coherent with international standards. And we have continued to work with Peru on the guidelines and implementing the merger control law, such as determining remedies, economic analysis behind mergers. So we're continued helping them strengthen the application of the merger control law. We encouraged Indicompi to undertake more market studies to understand better the key sectors or sectors which might be problematic, and we have a lot of guidance on how to carry out market studies. Most recently, they did one on the medical oxygen market, which is very timely given COVID. We also, at the OECD, encourage the publication of guidelines, and here Indicopy had not been publishing enough, and they developed guidelines on leniency and fighting bid rigging in public procurement. Guidelines are an extremely important advocacy tool. It creates predictability. Guidelines create transparency. It creates a level playing field, not only for firms that are already active within the country, but for firms who wish to become active in the country. For foreign firms who wish to invest, this helps to create a predictability and an understanding of the market which they hope to enter into. As a follow-up to the peer review, we are now, it's completed now. We undertook a project with Peru to improve the public procurement framework of Peru's social security body for the acquisition of medicines. We hope to see an improvement. We hope to see something like the chart that Antonio showed you in his presentation on the impact in Mexico of improved public procurement in their social security agency. Next slide, please. Now, the other case study, and it's a coincidence, I happen to choose Latin America, two Latin American countries because they are our most recent ones. Ecuador is a particularly interesting country. We just completed the peer review last year, and they've already achieved tremendous strides in implementing the recommendations. It's important to understand that Ecuador 3 years ago was very much outside, 4 years ago, was very, very much outside of the international community of competition authorities. They did not adhere to any international best practices or standards. They did not engage generally in international meetings. They very much had a different perspective on competition. With the election of a new government, and then they just had a re-election this year, they realized that, as I said, with Peru, competition can be an effective policy lever to alleviate poverty, alleviate inequality, stimulate productivity, stimulate innovation within the economy. And since then, they've made remarkable progress in reforming their entire competition framework, and we have been working very, very closely with them. It's a 180-degree turn from 4 years ago, and we're very proud of the work that Ecuador has undertaken. So what's interesting, it's not just the competition authority, but the government also stands behind. They have this supportive whole of government support behind the reforms. And while we can support the competition authority, the best reforms will take place when the government is also behind supporting the authority. And I believe that the government in Ecuador supports the authority so clearly because Ecuador undertook an enormous number of advocacy measures to inform the government about the importance of competition. All of the ministries, whether it was the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Commerce, they have an ongoing advocacy efforts to constantly explain why competition is important. So with the publication of our peer review last year, which we worked with the Inter-American Development Bank to do so, an executive decree has been implemented to modify the articles in the competition law that dealt with better defining the different conducts and exemptions. We found that in the competition law, these were very vague. They established a two-stage merger review system, and there was also a clarification of the responsibilities of the authority and the board because we found that senior members of the authority had too much power within the board, and this could create a conflict of interest or too much influence. Ecuador has also developed and applied a new methodology for the calculation of fines. I'm sorry I took away the link, and that's why you have the sentence dropping off. But if you're interested in this calculation of fines, please contact me. They also developed an application of new compliance guidelines, and this is to help on the investigation of abuse of market power. This is for companies, private firms to understand how to better comply with competition law. We've recently undertaken a lot of work on compliance. You're welcome to check our website. Development application of a new methodology for identifying bureaucratic barriers. This is something that Peru really takes the lead on, and Ecuador has based a lot of their new methodology on the work by Peru. Under development, we're hoping to undertake a project with them on fighting bid rigging and public procurement. We are currently determining if this is going to be possible, very similar to the work that we undertook with Peru and also with Brazil, because they see that there are economic benefits to ensuring that tendering processes are as competitive as possible. It's not only in terms of safeguarding scarce public resources, but it's also a question of ensuring the provision of quality services and also quality infrastructure projects. They're finishing 2 more guidelines. Again, as I mentioned with Peru, guidelines are extremely important to creating a transparent and predictable environment for business. And they're doing on the investigation of anti-competitive agreements and unfair competition. And also, as I said, advocacy efforts. They know that their budget is extremely small. It's too small for an economy of that size and for what they wish to achieve and the work that lies ahead of them. They have an enormous amount of work to be done. So they are working with the Ministry of Finance to explain why more budget is required. Next slide, please. So that's competition. The peer reviews are one way that we provide our recommendations that have stimulated these reforms. Antonio talked about Greece, and he talked about competition assessment. We have developed our OECD competition assessment toolkit. I realize those words might not mean very much to many people, but essentially the toolkit, it's a methodology to look at how regulation can restrain competition, how laws, legislation, guidelines, regulation can stop competition or can put a brake on competition, either existing or the toolkit can also be applied to draft laws and regulations. The potential for these laws and regulations to impede competition, and that's particularly interesting when the toolkit can be applied at the drafting stage, because as we know, it's always more difficult to amend existing laws and regulations. The toolkit helps governments, authorities to develop alternative, less restrictive policies that still achieve government objectives. And these government objectives are perfectly valid. They could be health, they could be safety, they could be environmental objectives, and all of them a government must safeguard. But can this safeguarding be done in a way which does not undermine or restrict competition? In some cases, yes, but maybe in some cases, no. And that's what we look at using our competition assessment toolkit. Antonio gave you an example, and I repeat again, of Greece, where productivity was stimulated in tourism sectors, in the milk market, by removing barriers to competition, and therefore the sector can reach its potential in contributing to the Greek economy. Next slide, please. So let me again, it's the OECD Competition Assessment Toolkit. It's designed for not only application by competition authorities, but also by policymakers who are not competition experts. And it's comprised of 3 volumes, principles, guidance, manual. It's all meant to be very, very easy to apply. There's a checklist, and it's really to ensure that public policy goals are met, but without stopping competition. Next slide, please. I'll give you finally a case study on this. We recently completed a competition assessment study in Tunisia, and we also have a second stage to this project. In the first stage, we looked at the wholesale and retail trade, and we also looked at the transport sectors. Now, a part of our competition assessment projects is to define the markets, to define the barriers. How big of a sector are we going to look at? So if we're looking at wholesale retail trade, are we also going to look at the logistics involved with these? Are we going to look at warehousing? Are we going to look at very, very small shops? But in general, what we're looking at is how can we make the wholesale and retail trade more productive, a better contribution to the economy. And then also in terms of transport sector, there too, there was choices to be made. Do we look at ports? Do we look at rail? Do we look at bus? Do we look at consumer? Do we look at trade, transport? How are we going to define a sector? So we define the sectors quite broadly in Tunisia, and this is where we see already the recommendations are being implemented. And so, for example, Tunisia most recently removed the requirement for authorizations to establish hypermarkets, and it's been replaced by cahier de charge with ex post control. And this means that it's much easier to establish a hypermarket, a very big grocery store. Therefore, consumers have more choice. There's more competition between grocery stores, which lowers the price, stimulates innovations, and generally the consumers therefore benefit. We also therefore have more entrants into the market as well. And other reforms that we know are being implemented regard agricultural cooperatives. We know the agricultural sector is very delicate. It's strategically important, it's extremely political, and we are aware of this. When we implement the recommendations, we do consider the specific domestic conditions of the economies that we're working with. We see port concessions as well, international trade companies, the carte de commerçant, all of this we've seen that our recommendations have been implemented. Next slide, please. Now, Iceland, I know Iceland is not a developing country, but I was so struck by how the progress Iceland is making in terms of reform to create more vibrant sectors in those where we carried out competition assessment. And it is a very small economy, relatively small. So I thought it would be interesting for you to see that OECD countries as well can have high regulatory barriers. This is not something that is only in emerging or developing countries, but it's something that many of our economies face. Antonio gave you an example of Australia, who implemented reforms, these regulatory reforms in the early 90s. They were really one of the pioneers. Japan as well is a pioneer in looking at regulatory reform. And so now I want to just turn to Iceland. We carried out competition assessment in the tourism sector and professions, and then also in building as well. I was not involved with this project, so I'm trying to remember. In the tourism sector, which is very important to Iceland and is growing, we recommended that they reform the law on restaurants and accommodation, abolishing the mandatory standards and legal requirements for hotels and other tourist accommodation. It lowers the licensing fees and removes some of the duplicate licenses in the tourism sector. You might recall earlier that I said that competition assessment looked at regulatory barriers, legislative barriers, but also looked at the cost of doing business. So when licensing fees are very high or the licensing process is very long and complicated, this potentially excludes players from the market. Therefore, prices might remain high or a lack of innovation. So we look at whether or not those licenses are necessary, whether or not the fees are set at a, what is the word that I'm looking for? A proportional amount, if the licensing fees are proportional to the requirements, and whether or not all of the licenses are necessary. Because we do understand at times that licenses are necessary. We understand that fees are necessary, but are they proportional? And so therefore, when necessary, we will make recommendations to either remove licensing or to simplify the procedures. In terms of the regulated professions, as you know, might be lawyers, notaries, they could be architects, nurses. So we looked at the professions in Iceland. As a result of our recommendations, they've established an interministerial working group to work on the reform of professions. There's a draft law underway to abolish 17 regulated professions. Why, for example, were hat makers regulated? Was there a safety issue? We don't know about it. Or was it because there was a small cohort of hat makers who wanted to make it difficult for others to enter into the market? And that's the type of questions we're looking at. In a second phase of reform, more professions will be abolished. Many of the current educational requirements will be loosened or removed. For example, obligatory apprenticeship with master tradesmen, and instead vocational training or formal education will suffice. It will not be necessary, therefore, also to have an apprenticeship. And again, sometimes these educational qualifications might no longer be necessary. Maybe there's a reason for it in the past, but the legislation has not been continually updated. It has not been kept modern or kept up with the times. So this is something else that we will consider. The law of industry, which is the one that is currently lists all the regulated professions, will be amended, and a new law will be proposed, which will abolish many of the regulated ones and leaving in place only those that have an obvious public interest objective. And some of those might be nurses, doctors, maybe lawyers as well. And then finally, the working group will work with the Ministry of Education to revise the requirements to qualify as a professional. As I said, maybe in the past these requirements were necessary, but they might not be now. And this is all the types of recommendations that we provide. So it's really also a modernization of the regulatory framework of the sector that we looked at. Next slide, please. And then finally, in terms of Iceland, one last point. Based on the OECD report, the Ministry of Finance has acknowledged many failures in the running of Isavia. I'm not quite sure how that's pronounced. And Isavia is the company that runs the airports. So now they are looking at the management model of Isavia and the Keflavik airport. And this is a result of us studying the sector. And we look all the way up and down the supply chain. We looked at the planning and building, the building sector, and here we had recommendations on the planning and building regulations, which are ongoing, and recommendations so far we know they've been implemented or are being implemented. And these include a creation of an electronic platform to submit planning documents, which makes it much easier and much less expensive, much less time consumer than what is the process now, which is a physical submission of papers. Next slide, please. So what other reforms have we seen in emerging or developing countries? We worked with Brazil on their public procurement framework. We reviewed it with them to how they could strengthen it. And as a result, Brazil has adopted a new public procurement law in April 2021. I should mention as well that the competition law in Brazil underwent several iterations since 2005. We carried out 3 peer reviews of Brazil's competition framework where they adopted our recommendations, and as a result, the current structure with CADE comes out of our peer reviews. Costa Rica, who is now a member of the OECD, underwent also a peer review. They have amended substantially their competition law to meet OECD standards. There was issues around independence. They had several exemptions, which have now been revised within the new law. We carried out a very complex project across ASEAN, looking at the logistics sectors in the 10 ASEAN countries, and also looking at state-owned enterprises. Competitive neutrality in the 10 countries. Now, competitive neutrality not only applies to state-owned enterprises, it also applies to creating a level playing field for example, foreign firms who wish to come into a market. We just completed this project. We don't have any results yet about how many of our recommendations have been adopted, nor will they be adopted, but this is something that will be very interesting for us to see. Ukraine as well, we have been looking at public procurement within the energy sector. We're carrying out other projects within the energy sector. Again, this is brand new. We just completed the project, so we don't know what recommendations have been adopted. But it's interesting for us to see that these countries across ASEAN are interested in reform, and Ukraine as well is interested in reform. The next slide, please. So let me now cover other reforms that I know have been adopted within countries, within emerging economies. Egypt is particularly interesting. Egypt, as one of your neighbors, you might be interested in it. They adopted a new merger control law. They looked at our standard and recommendation to do so. They also looked at our bid rigging work, which Antonio spoke to you about, to produce guidelines on the application of competition provisions in the public procurement law. They also considered our work when looking at developing their advocacy plan to raise awareness amongst public entities about bid rigging. Oftentimes, the competition authorities have to go across government to all the different agencies that undertake public procurement to explain to them about bid rigging and how the authority can help them run better tendering processes. In Georgia, they have new rules on behavioral and structural remedies in mergers. They have new procedural rules with regards to investigation procedure. As I mentioned, we have a new recommendation on procedural fairness. And here, Georgia used it to adopt a new bylaw that requires full judicial review of the agency's decisions. This is guaranteed now, including the power of the court to change the amount of the fine imposed by the agency. This, of course, requires that the court is well versed in competition and has a thorough understanding of competition. And then also, there has been amendments to their competition law regarding dawn raids. The previous speaker referred to the napkin that was in the drawer that defined the cartel, and that's the type of thing that is caught with dawn raids, which Georgia will now be able to catch as well. Malaysia, they have, using our work, they've improved their processes to identify potential bid rigging. You'll see that within emerging economies, there is a lot that is done to strengthen the fight against bid rigging in public procurement, and this is for two reasons. One, it's that for a competition authority, this is a relatively easy type of infringement to investigate and to stop in comparison to other types of anti-competitive acts that can be very difficult to prove. Furthermore, the results of catching collusion has good, it's good source for advocacy. Therefore, the competition authority can explain to the public and to the government how it has managed to save taxpayers' money. So it's a very important vehicle for advocacy, for authorities, for government to show why competition is important, how competition can help you, the individual, this person, save taxpayers' money. So that's why many developing emerging countries will focus on fighting bid rigging as a priority within their enforcement stable. And then Indonesia, we know they've undertaken some revision of their leniency regime and of their sanctioning methodologies based on our work. So next slide, please. All of this information is available on our website. I encourage you to use it. You'll find many more examples of reform within emerging economies that we are confident has taken place to our best practice standards. As I said, I did not want to talk about countries where we have not worked because one, I didn't want to repeat other people's work, and two, I wanted to ensure that I could have confidence in what I was saying and that the reforms truly do meet OECD or international best practices and standards. Next slide, please. Je tiens à vous remercier pour votre attention. C'est vraiment un plaisir d'être ici parmi vous. Si vous avez des questions, si vous cherchez des informations, si vous cherchez quelque chose, n'hésitez pas à m'envoyer un email. Mon email était affiché, mais je crois que les organisateurs de cette conférence seraient ravis de vous donner mes contacts.
My email is displayed here, and the organizer can share the contact. Thank you very much, Madam Person. We have got an idea about methodology, about competition assessment, and the benchmark on which we can use in Algeria.
Start with the last speaker, and then we will take Q&A question for you, both of you at the end. So now we will have the chance to hear, last but not least, Mr. Ruben Maximiano, which is the Senior Competition Area and also the Asia Pacific Regional Manager at Oecd. Mr. Maximiano.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Bonjour à tous. I'm going to speak about carrying on the themes of today, and out of my colleague, my esteemed colleague Lynn Robertson. I'll speak about the role for competition policy and economic recovery specifically. which I think is a very important topic at this moment. So you mentioned that I was responsible for Asia Pacific region. That's true. I'm also responsible for the COVID-19 recovery work that we've been doing here at the OECD on competition, and it's in that hat that I will be speaking today. So I saw with great interest that you have a Plan de Relance 2020-2024 that you issued in June this year, which is a comprehensive 200-page recovery plan to diversify the economy and reform, amongst those topics, the competition law regime, and focus on some high-level sectors, high-value sectors. So what we're talking about here, in a sense, is industrial policy, and that raises the question of how to do it best and how to make sure that it's integrated by competition principles, which is one way of ensuring that, in fact, it is working at its best. So I will touch upon this briefly. Can I put the slides? Or can you put up the slides for me? Are they up? Okay, so I'm going to speak, therefore, on the role for competition policy in economic recovery. If we go to the next slide already, this is briefly the overview, some insights from previous economic crises. What can we learn? What lessons can we take? What lessons can the Algerian governments and policymakers bring in from all the previous crises that have been so much studied across the world in the last few years? Then we'll look at the framework to assess distortions of competition through the lens of competitive neutrality, this idea of a level playing field between market players. And lastly, if there's time, I will look quickly at the methodology and framework for analysis of the role of SOEs, which is, SOEs are very important. I know that in Algeria, they took a very, very important role during the crisis. Many of SOEs were brought to fight COVID, mandated to produce masks, hand sanitizers, and ventilators. So they play a very important role, and of course, they also make up a lot of the economic tissue in Algeria. So if we go to the next slide, this is just to say that this is work that we've been doing on the COVID-19 crisis and competition policy, the role it can play. And so we tried to answer the question about what role for competition policy in that paper. And I would invite you to read that paper. Essentially, I'm distilling its findings here today. So if we go to the first slide on insights, if we go to the next slide. So we have, past crises can really provide very important lessons that policymakers can draw. And there's a few, if we are going to make some high-level discoveries, let's say, findings from the work that we've done on this. The first one is the suspension of antitrust laws holds back recovery. So if you don't have active antitrust laws in place that are being actively enforced, this leads to cartelization, and this leads to reduced speed of economic recovery. Looking at the most studied crisis of them all, which is the Great Depression of the 1930s in the US, there's a lot of empirical work that's gone into that analysis. And in that crisis, what did we have? We had the Roosevelt administration effectively suspended cartel enforcement. So they stopped pursuing cartels under the National Industrial Recovery Act. And the impact of that was that suddenly industries that were not cartelized became cartelized very quickly. And the empirical research shows that even though growth was fast following the Depression, it would have been much faster had cartels not been allowed. And there's even one empirical study that's widely cited that shows that if the active enforcement of competition laws had been taking place, the recovery would have been 7 years faster than in fact it was. So that's quite a significant result. So the first lesson is suspension of antitrust laws holds back recovery. The second one is that merger control, which has a very important structural element to it, because it impedes the creation of structural market structures, let's say, creation of market structures that then are very difficult to tackle. And that's how you can crystallize anti-competitive structures. So it's very important to maintain also a very active merger control. And we saw that from lessons, for instance, from Japan in the 1990s and in the 2000s crisis in the banking sector in particular. The third is that anti-competitive policies can hinder economic recovery. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's commendable the document that you have, very interesting and important document that you have on la relance de l'économie. But at the same time, there needs to be care that those measures are not actually hindering the economic recovery as much as they can, as much as they might in the long term. So an example here of outcome of policies that restricted competition, again, is from Japan in the 1990s, which led to import barriers and price controls, and then that actually led to significant cartelization, and again led to a very prolonged recession, more than it should have been. So that's the next lesson, and because it's essentially, and then the next lesson from that is that state support should include exit incentive instruments. So here again an example from the U.S. from the financial crisis of 2008, where there was interventions by the U.S. Government in the car industry, and with the troubled assets and relief program, the TARP as it's called, and that led to the important lesson that having an element of exit in building within the measures that are made, an element of exit, allowing the exit from the state support in the long term is extremely important, because otherwise you will be feeding, let's say, zombie firms, so-called zombie firms. That's firms that are not as productive as it might be. They're actually meaning that more productive firms that are not yet in the market cannot enter because they're occupying space in the market, let's say, but they're not bringing the dynamism to the economy that is needed to recover quickly from an economic crisis. And so the last lesson really is that crisis can be a good opportunity to identify and strengthen pro-competitive structural measures, such as the ones that Lynn mentioned before me. And, the maybe important to bring here into the context of the crisis is that the Greek project that Lynn and Antonio mentioned earlier came precisely on the back of the great financial crisis of 2008-2009, and where the OECD identified regulatory barriers to competition in several sectors, as Lynn mentioned, and that led to a more dynamic growth following these structural suggestions on manufacturing, retail trade, wholesale trade, tourism, and construction. And what we saw is that the OECD is 60 years old this year, and we had at the commemoration of those 60 years the Prime Minister of Greece speaking as one of the guests of honor. And it was important to mention how much he underlined that project, the importance of pro-competitive reforms undertaken by the OECD in cooperation with the Greek authorities, and in particular the Greek Competition Authority, how important that was for the economic recovery that we've seen in Greece. So if we go to the next slide, building on the lessons from past crises, it's important to be aware of the benefits of competition, of advocating actively for competition policy, that it's more important now than ever to do that. This is for a number of reasons. But the first reason is that, policymakers face short-run costs. They need to make quick decisions, fast decisions that to solve short-run issues. And they might look, therefore, for benefits that are immediately visible and tangible. This is perfectly commendable and normal to do. But what's important is that they also give adequate consideration to long-term costs, to less visible benefits that can come from well-functioning markets in the medium to the long term. Secondly, it's also easier to link short-term benefits to specific policy actions that you take now in the present. And that might bias policymakers towards short-term fixes because the market structures, they leave long-term consequences, but perhaps it's more difficult to understand exactly where those problems come from, when perhaps they're coming from a policy measure that's taken now and that doesn't consider those costs now when it's being taken. And so we think that governments should respect the principle of competitive neutrality whenever there's state support that is providing to businesses. To the extent possible, these should be horizontal support, not firm-specific. If it is firm-specific, we'll see how that can be done in the best possible way. And that competition authorities should be part of the whole of government approach. You need to consider competition policy when you're designing these policies, but also when you're implementing those policies. And that means that government should empower and should resource authorities that are doing that work, so that they have the resources needed to undertake that sort of analysis in a timely fashion. So if we go to the next, we start going, so these are the general comments that I had to make, let's say. Now let's go into the specifics of how. How can you make sure that happens, that you're ensured that the principles of competition are embedded in the design measures and industrial policy support measures that you're undoubtedly planning? If we go to the next slide, please. One major instrument that I would encourage you to look at is one that was adopted this year in the context of the crisis by the OECD, and that's the OECD recommendation on competitive neutrality. It was published on the 1st of June this year, and essentially it establishes a set of principles to promote a level playing field amongst competitors and prevent situations where the state grants advantages to certain entities selectively and thereby inadvertently distorting competition within a market. So if we go to the next slide, this is what competitive neutrality means. It's really that all enterprises face the same set of rules, both on the enforcement side as well as on the regulatory side. It's not just about subsidies, it's about any action that might eventually unlevel that playing field, that might give or confer a specific advantage to any market participant. Again, we'll come back to the how on this aspect in a little bit. And then it's not just about SOEs. It's not just about discriminating SOEs or treating SOEs differently from private entities. It's also between private entities as well, and domestic and foreign entities as well. So the next slide, as we said, it's very important that there's this role for advocacy of competition, because when you're making those measures, you must take into account the unintended consequences. I mentioned the long-term impacts on markets. Those competition people, competition professionals, competition authorities are well placed to understand how markets work. They have specific skill sets that allow them to understand how perhaps some of these measures might implicate and have negative effects and costs on the economy. So what we know is that state support, when it unlevels the playing field, when it selects some entities over another, it has the potential to disrupt the game of markets, the game of market entry, and the game of exit. So if you're receiving state support, that can influence the incentives that you have to compete and how you compete. But it also influences whether you exit the market, that particular product, you stop producing that product. But it also influences whether entities, new companies, will come in, because perhaps you're giving advantage to a firm that is not more productive, but is present on the marketplace. Whilst a new entry might bring new ways of doing things, might be more productive, but he doesn't have the chance or she to come in. to the marketplace. So what we're saying is that competition considerations need to be considered. And that's where I come into the framework of analysis. We go to the next slide. If we go to the next slide, please. We have the framework of analysis, and then the next slide, we have, no, the previous one. Yeah, so this one. Let's look at how we can actually look at the principles for economic analysis and state support. And here we draw a lot of lessons from the European Union. It has a very specific expertise on state aid, on looking at state support measures from a competition distortions perspective. And looking at that, and in our work, we looked at that very carefully, and we distilled some of the main economic principles. The first one is that competition authorities, even if they don't have the power to actually control for state support measures, which are at the hands of policymakers, of course, they can still advocate. They can still analyze the measures and make proposals for how to ensure that the measures are as respectful of market functioning as possible. So the European Commission uses a balancing test, which takes into account a set of economic principles. The first one is that I identify the objective of the aid. It's important that policymakers identify what is the market failure that this state support measure is meant to address. What is at stake here? What are we trying to solve? What is it that the market cannot provide that can only be provided for by the state? So that very clear idea is important for everything that comes afterwards, because that ensures that the measure is well targeted, that it's the most appropriate measure, most appropriate instrument to achieve that goal, that has the incentive, what's called the incentive effect. So when you're providing state support, what you're doing is you're providing an incentive for the beneficiary of that state support to act in a certain way. So what you need to know is this support measure the best way to provide that incentive for that player, that market player, to behave in a certain way, to produce more of a certain good, to maintain itself in the market? And is it proportional? Is it the most cost-effective way of reducing or eliminating the market failure? And is it the minimum amount necessary to achieve that goal? Because if you're going beyond that, then you might be providing what's called in economics the economic rents, or undue profits, let's say, that go beyond what's strictly necessary for that measure to take the effect, the desirable effect that the government or the policymakers were hoping to achieve when they provided that support. In this context, considering financial viability of the firm, of the beneficiary, is an important criteria. So the potential beneficiary of state support should submit evidence to policymakers that they were not experiencing financial distress before the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, that this is specifically, the state support is needed because of COVID-19. I think evidence needs to be provided specifically showing that the company was viable before the financial crisis, but also importantly, also looking into the future. An analysis into the future should come into play as well. To what extent may the crisis actually change consumer preferences, change production technologies, change value chains in the way they operate, change business models in certain sectors? And perhaps the model that was there before is no longer adequate for the changed market environment. So you risk, if you provide state support, that the shift that's needed towards the new business models doesn't take place, and that you're keeping old business models in place, zombie firms that are perhaps not providing as much as a push to your economy as otherwise might be desirable. So the point here is that the state intervention should not necessarily be designed to preserve market structures that existed before COVID-19, but to promote competitive structures and growth of Algeria in the long term. And that means inevitably also letting some firms exit the market, even if you accompany that with other sorts of measures that might allow for the expertise and the skill sets of the labor force to adapt to the new circumstances. As regards proportionality of the aid, of the state support, what we propose in our paper is that a counterfactual analysis be carried out, very much like it happens in merger control, where you're looking at incentives into the future. Again, the counterfactual explains, what would happen with and without the state support. And if you manage to identify correctly the scenarios, as much as possible, of course, or the several potential scenarios, that allows you to ensure that you're not providing too much support for the aid that for the effect that you wish to do. So that's an operational tip, let's say, for how to undertake the analysis of proportionality. And for that, you need to also consider the sector. How dynamic is it? How is it changing? Is it being affected temporarily by the COVID crisis? Can we expect it to go back to normal afterwards? Or a temporary negative effect? Or is there actually a long-term shift? And if there's a long-term shift, as I mentioned earlier, providing a state support should be seen with a bit more care. Because that might mean that the necessary shifts and reallocation of resources in Algeria might take time, which might mean that it will lose competitiveness if it's supporting industries that perhaps in the future, post-crisis, will not be there in the same way, to the same extent, at least. So what I mean is that there needs to be a balancing act between the positive impact that the measure is expected to have and the expected risks, the expected costs to competition. And then that asks the question, can you achieve those objectives, that positive impact of the measure, in a way that somehow reduces the competition distortions to markets? Because we know markets can bring a lot of benefits to your economies. Let me just give you some further aspects that you might consider when you're understanding this balancing act. What is the size of the recipient firm, the beneficiary of the state support? That could be a first indicator of how much distortion there is of competition. And usually you can do this by looking at market shares, or looking at turnover, or looking at the amount of employment that company has. That could be a measure of how much impact that state support might have in competitive markets. So if we go to the next slide, what needs to be considered is that we don't have a magic crystal ball that will allow us to understand which markets are going to be there after the crisis, or how much they will need to change after the crisis in order to ensure the competitiveness of the Algerian competitiveness of the Algerian economy. So one of the things that we propose to be done, in a way, it's kind of like an exit strategy, let's say, for state support, is that you consider and that competition personnel, competition authorities, but also policymakers consider clawback mechanisms to be included at the outset, so that if any support is verified at a later date, in 5 years from now, 3 years from now, to be disproportionate, then that, because it was excessive, perhaps the market did not move in exactly the same direction, and that therefore it meant that the state support was vastly bigger than it would have been needed, then there should be a mechanism, and there exists in European Union law a mechanism for the return of that state support, or parts of that state support, to the state. And this is particularly important in the markets that I described before, this idea where this markets will have a great degree of uncertainty at the time that you design in a support measure. This is one of the ways in which to make sure that you're getting it right, by inserting mechanisms in your measure itself. that can be done. So in applicable circumstances, when the balancing of the competition distortions effects outweigh the
sorry to interrupt you. You have almost 5 minutes to finish. It's okay for you?
Yes. I have 2 more slides, and then I'm finished. Okay, so here the idea is that the competition authority or the policymakers should consider compensatory measures. So if you look at different options, you consider that in order to achieve the objective, you need to do that measure, that state support, you need to provide that state support measure to that particular company, reduction in taxes, or subsidy or loan, non-commercial rates. You might wish to, but you know that there's going to be anti-competitive harm, distortions that come from that measure. That is a big company that's receiving that will probably allow it to do predatory pricing and to exclude competitors because it's receiving the subsidy. Then perhaps you might think about including what's called compensatory measures that are directly linked to what's expected to happen. Very much like competition authorities do when they're looking at mergers. They might ask for a divestiture of assets. They might ask for behavioral remedies. They might ask, and the EU Commission asks for certain state subsidies context price limitations intended to prevent the beneficiary to engage in that exclusionary behavior, so that they can pursue a predatory strategy with the money they receive from the state. So that's remedies for mitigating competition distortions, essentially, is what I'm talking about. And it can also be used to seek to reduce barriers to entry. This is a very important element. So the compensatory measures, the remedies, might actually mean that you're inserting in the measure reductions of barriers to entry or reductions to market power. The example of Lufthansa during the crisis in the European Union is very interesting. They found that after a market analysis that in Frankfurt and Munich airports, there was market power on Lufthansa. They were receiving 6 billion euros from the state. And the compensatory measure there was, okay, in Frankfurt and Munich, where you have significant market power, you need to divest yourself of 24 slots so that other operators can enter those markets. So reducing barriers to entry. So if we, the main point here is that it's important that competition can help design the measures adequately, and that you need to have exit strategies, the clawback mechanism I mentioned, the sunset clauses. So putting in legislation a time limit, which then means that once that time limit or certain criteria are met, then automatically there's a rollback of that measure. So we believe that competition policy should be a cornerstone of industrial policy. Industrial policy should be carefully designed to make sure that in the long term, in the medium term, there is competition working in markets, because we know with reduced regulatory barriers to entry, to make sure that markets are functioning well in the long term. So if we go to the next slide, and it's essentially my last slide before my concluding remarks, this is an opportunity for pro-competitive reforms. The document you have, it's a very interesting one, the one in June 2021. This is an opportunity of doing what we call a low-cost regulatory refresh. You don't need significant amounts of money to plow into the economy to make it come back to life again. What you can do is you just take your legislative pen and you look at the rules and legislations, and you look, which is a relatively low-cost way of looking at it, and you understand how to make laws better targeted for better functioning markets. We've done that, as I mentioned earlier, in many jurisdictions. In Tunisia, in ASEAN, we've looked at the logistics sector, where we've done that. Countries are actually implementing the recommendations to make sure that the whole logistics industry, so important for exports, is working as well as it can, and that's by reducing barriers to entry, looking at the legislation and making it sharper, making it more fit for purpose, making it allowing companies to come in, new business models to come in. And we've seen that in the current crisis in many countries. Mexico has has proposed to the government a number of measures based on market studies that have been doing over the years. In Spain as well, as I mentioned in ASEAN, it's taken a life of its own as all the economic ministers of the 10 ASEAN countries decided to implement some of our recommendations. So if I go to my concluding remarks, so it's on slide 18, I'll finish just in 2 minutes, if that's okay. Can we go to the last slide, please? Last slide, yeah, all the way to the end. So the first point I wanted to make is that, competition law, competition policies, competition principles, sorry, next slide, are really not a, next slide. Next slide. Are really, this one, are really not a political luxury. They play an important role for your economic recovery. And that can be done by taking it into account the unintended consequences of markets. What are the costs to competition that comes from a particular measure? And competition authorities should participate in assessing the costs to competition. They are well equipped to do that, but they will need to have staff, recruiting staff that's technically competent and skilled. You need to make sure, of course, that the competition reforms are inserted in your laws. Unctad made some proposals a few years ago. I think enforcement is important, and that requires a competent, set of skill staff, adequate set of skills at the competition authorities in general, and advocacy of laws and regulations. They need to have also the skills and also the adequate resources and people to look at laws and regulations, look at the measures that are being proposed, and advocating for inserting competition thinking, competition lens into those laws and regulations and public policy measures. These, I think, are the important principles that we've taken away from all the work that we've done on economic recovery, and I'm happy to take any questions to have a discussion on one or more of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Maximiano. So we understood very well the concept of competitive neutrality and how the state should create the framework for good recovery, even just after the current pandemic situation. Maybe we'll finish with one question for both of you, because we're reaching the end of the morning lecture. I will see if someone raised their hand, or I have one question. We understood that for both of you, we understood that that on the long term, having a good competition law framework is essential. But my question is, especially in the context of post-pandemic recovery, do you assess the impact of your recommendation on the short-term recovery, which means, for instance, the state can have the temptation to work with a few companies that have the capacity to transform those subsidies into productivity. Do you think your recommendation has an impact on the short-term recovery or short-term productivity? Thank you. If there are other questions, raise your hand.
Okay, maybe I can try and take that question, and then maybe Lynn can come in. I mean, our recommendations is from the work that we've been doing is that yes, that's the short answer to your question. So it's important that the short-term measures are well understood. What are they meant to achieve? What are the objectives that they're meant to? Where are they meant to take the economy? So once you know that, you know what the policy proposal is and what the objectives are. And having those objectives in mind, you need to understand also that this might have an impact. Okay, in the short term, it might solve the problem, but what is the impacts that it's leaving in the medium to long term on markets, on how markets function? And I think that's where it becomes very important to understand what those impacts might be. So, in the example you said, this is the only company that's active in the market that could perhaps take us to that objective, to that short-term objective, which is important to keep the economy afloat, for instance. What we don't say is, well, you can't do that. That's not what we say. We say, well, if that's the objective, and if that's the only way to achieve, we ask the question, is that the only way to achieve that objective? And if there are other ways of achieving, if there aren't other ways to achieve that objective, then how can we make sure that we're mitigating the anti-competitive impacts on markets in the medium to long term? And that's when it becomes important to take into consideration lowering barriers to entry. Okay, I'm going to provide this support because that's the only way for this outcome to be achieved, and I'm going to save the economy in the short term. But then I'm going to integrate into that instrument perhaps a policy plan to reduce barriers to entry in the following years, so that in the following years that company that's being supported now will have to be playing the competitive game, will have to be at its best, will have to be exercising innovation and reducing prices for consumers. What we don't want is to crystallize because of a crisis and because that's the only way to achieve an objective, but then there's a crystallized situation that you, for many years, are having to deal with, and that's burdening the economy for many years. So our proposal is put in place compensatory measures if possible, or at least put in place a methodology for reducing barriers to entry as soon as possible.
I think that Ruben gave a very comprehensive reply. So I would only add that measures should be not so much directed at one firm, but directed towards the sector entirely, and therefore they can be more long-term and sustainable, because if there's measures that are directed specifically to one firm, two firms, as Ruben mentioned, this creates risks in the long run. The other point that I would add too is that as we talk about using this opportunity to build back better and incorporate other public policy objectives into industrial policy, such as this is our chance as we build back better in economic recovery to consider environmental or labor, to ensure that the competition authority is at the table, and that at least that these measures are competition neutral. So I would say that the competition authority has an important advocacy role to play to ensure that it is at the table as recovery policies are designed by government.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very clear. Thank you for all the speakers. So we've learned a lot of things today. We will have a close look at the material you shared with us. And we will now have a break for lunch. So, donc on va clôturer pour la matinée aujourd'hui.
Here we come to the end to the first session, the morning session. We thank all the speakers from OECD, Madam Ning, Kapioni, Mr. Lin, Madam Lin. We can meet at 1:45, and thank you very much. Have a good lunch. Thank you very much, Shaki, for chairing this morning's session. And I would like to thank the representative of the National Council of the Social Dialogue who are following us from Tunisia, and the Chad, Niger, Mali, and Mauritania, who are online as invitees. Thank you very much for your patience in this session, but we need you after lunch at 2 a.m. for a discussion with Algerian experts who are with us. We need your ideas. You need your recommendation to raise them to the government. I hope you will be attending the afternoon. Thank you very much and have a good lunch.
Thank you. Merci, au revoir. À cet après-midi.
Thank you very much.